In this video, we're going to add wheels, glass, and more details to our Porsche 911 concept. Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video, we're going to start to add those realistic details to make this look more like a real car. So if you haven't been following along, you can download the model from the description in the video and carry on from here, but I strongly urge that you go back to part 1 and you work through the modeling process on your own. Now, I know everybody doesn't have 6.5 hours to try to work through modeling the body, so again, the body that you see on the screen is in the description. Another thing in the description of the video is some rotiform rims that I modeled in a previous series. So in that series, we modeled these rims for a different size. So they've been modified so that they're now 20-inch, and there's a wider version for the rear. So you can go into the description of the video and you can use these rims if you wish, or you can bring in your own. So the first step in this process is to go ahead and bring in the rims. And the reason I want to do it in this order is because that way, if we have to make any more tweaks to the body, adjust the wheel openings or anything like that, we can do it before we start adding those extra details. So the way that I'm going to do this, if you have them uploaded to your data panel, is simply just drag and drop them into your model. When we do this, we need to position it. And this is the rear rim, so I'm going to pull it up about where I want it. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in. And you want to get it roughly centered in the wheel arch. And then I'm going to rotate around to a back view and simply pull it out where I want the wheel to be positioned. Now, in this case, I want the wheel to be just inside of the fender, so it has that look. That looks pretty good. I'm going to say OK. I'm going to repeat the process with the front. Now, again, the front is a bit narrower. These rims are rather large. They are 20-inch, but they're also pretty wide. Now, the way that I want to do this is I'm going to bring this to the rear because I want these to be at the same height. I could have used some manual numbers to position these, but I want to make sure that they are at least visually at the same height. It's going to be important when we start to render. Then I want to just simply push it into the right location. Looks like it's centered in the wheel arch. Rotate around to the front and pull it out where it needs to be. Again, we're looking at putting it in the wheel arch, and we want to position it just so that it sticks out just ever so slightly, and that looks pretty good. So now that we have the front and the rear rims in place, the next step is to adjust the body. Now, when we're talking about wheel arches, it's important that we get the fitment right. And stock cars generally have more room between the wheel and the fender, just simply because of suspension travel. But when you get to make a wide body version or you start to customize a car, generally the fitment between the rim and the fender lip is going to be critical to how it looks. This is just way too much space for this car. Now, the only thing that we could do other than adjusting the body would be to increase the size of the wheel. Now, when I played around with this before, it needs about a 22-inch rim with a decent amount of tire to fill that in, and it just doesn't look right with the scale of the car. So now that we have the wheels in, we can go back to our form body and we can edit. The wheels will still be here. They're not selectable. You can see the opacity changes, but we still have a visual reference as to their size. This is going to be a little tricky, so we're going to have to be extremely careful. The first thing I'm going to do is go into box display mode, and then I want to remind myself that we have some extremely close edges here. Now, these edges are important because if we start scaling things down without selecting those, it's going to be problematic. So I'm going to double click this first one and notice that it grabs this entire edge. Now, what I actually want to do is I want to scale down the entire fender lip, but I want to keep the outside section of the flare in the same place. So in order to do this, I need to select the first edge that I want. Then I need to move on to the edge on the back, remembering which one we selected. It's the inside edge here. And then we're going to hold down Shift, remembering that we have a T-point here. We're going to hold down Shift and double click. It'll grab that. We're going to repeat the process here. We're going to hold down Shift and select that, rotate around, hold down Shift and double click here. We should see the entire loop. We're going to do the same thing at the back because we do need to scale that down as well. We do have symmetry, so it is going to work on both sides at the same time. And then we also need to bring in these other lips that are controlling the shape. And this is going to get a bit tricky because the loop, the double click isn't going to work. So we're going to have to manually select the first two, the third one, and then we're going to come over here, shift double click. I am holding down shift the entire time. You notice that we're missing a little piece here. We might need to go in and reconnect that. We can do that in a minute. And we also want to scale down this as well. So I'm going to shift click that still, and shift and double click here. So the thing that we want to do is we want to scale all of this down. What I want to do is I'm going to go to modify and edit form. I'm going to reset my pivot and I want to stick it at the center of the wheel, but then I want to pull it down. Now the reason I want to pull it down is I want to get it roughly centered between the wheel arch and about at the bottom. It doesn't have to be perfect, but this is going to help us. We're going to say okay to the pivot location, and then we're going to begin scaling this down vertically. We want to get it to be roughly where the rim is. We can switch between smooth and box display, but notice that that resets our pivot point. So if we switch, we need to reset the pivot point again. And now that we've scaled that down, we want to scale it smaller in this case, Y direction. So we're tightening it up on that wheel. So you can see that the wheel is kind of overlapping it. It's okay for what we're going to be doing in our renders. In reality, the fender well is not going to just go straight back. It's going to go up and then over. But for our purposes, it's going to be fine. So that's going to help us out. I'm going to go back to box display. I'm going to left click. And we've resized that front fender. I'm going to do the same thing on the rear. Again, remembering that we've got these small lips. So we need to select, hold down shift. We need to shift, double click the inside edge here. I'm going to click this one. I'm going to shift, double click here. We're going to select here, here, and here. We're going to work our way over, shift, double click. We want to grab all of the edges that we're interested in, and we want to make sure that we scale those down. So that looks pretty good. Remember that we do want to bring in the inside of our fender as well. If we select a vertex, that's okay. We can simply deselect it. But we really want to focus on the edges and make sure that we get all of those small edges. If we don't, we're going to cause problems. Once we have that, I'm going to switch to smooth display. Make sure that all the edges are still selected. I'm going to reset my pivot to roughly the middle of the wheel and then pull it down. I'm going to OK the pivot, and then I'm going to start scaling it down vertically. And again, what we're looking for is to get relatively close to that wheel, and then we want to scale it down this direction. And again, this is sort of the fitment that we're looking for. We want it to be really tight in there, and that's going to be sort of the look that we're going for to make sure that our wheel is filling everything out. Once we have that, we can select Finish Form, and if we made all of our selections, then everything should work just fine. Now you can see the fenders are much tighter to the wheels. That looks a bit better. Now, if you want to make any more adjustments, you want to make sure that you do it back here. If the wheels are in the way that we can get around that is by hiding them in the design and then going ahead and editing the form body. You might also actually want to hide the form body itself. So the main body here. And then once we edit form, it will show us the form body without that transparency. So you can see if we go into bodies and we hide, let's say, the tail lights and we hide the wing and the Aero, you can see that those are still there and transparent. But because we hid the body and the wheels, they're not visible there. Okay, so as we look here, there's a little edge that we want to connect. So we're going to go to Insert Point, and I'm going to carry this over, hit Enter, just help control that edge a little bit. And you can kind of see that the resolution or the shading that's happening on this edge isn't perfect. Part of that is just the nature of the way that the model is being shaded. If you want to control that a bit better, you can add additional edges. It gets a little tricky, but you can go to Insert Edge and just stick one relatively close, and then you can tighten that edge up a bit more. If we go to Control and 4 to hide, you can see that we can tighten that up a bit more. There is going to be diminishing returns, so I'm going to use Control Z to get rid of that. I'm just going to sort of leave it how it is. So once we're happy with all those changes, once again, Finish Form, we will need to go back and show the body and show the wheels. But now you can see that they fit pretty well. Now, if we want to open that space up, we certainly can. But again, for our renders, this is going to be this is going to be fine. In reality, once again, the lip sort of rolls back up, but we're gonna keep it like this for our renders. It's going to be okay. Before we go on any further, I'm going to select both of these wheels. I'm going to mirror them to the other side. And the mirror plane is going to be based off of the midline of the car. So you can see now we've got rims on both sides. It's starting to look a bit more like a real car. Let's go ahead and make a quick save, and then we can move on to adding some more details. So the next thing I want to do is I'm going to hide the tail light, the Aero, and the wing. I don't need to see them right now. We'll come back to that stuff later. But what I do want is I want to start creating the window openings. That's going to be the first step for me. Now this can be done several different ways. The first way that we want to do this is by simply creating a sketch wherever the windows are. So when we look at this, you can see that there is a slight difference from the blueprint. You can see that the edge that was created on this surface is a little bit lower than the edge on the blueprint. Now this is actually a drip rail on the car, and the window is just below that. So this is one of those cases where we're going to be a little bit more lenient with the shape, and we're not going to perfectly match the blueprint because the shape of our car ended up having this edge that carries here and this edge that carries here. And if we try to make the shape of the window different, it's not going to look right. So the way that I'm going to go about this is I'm going to create a sketch. It's going to be done on my my right plane, which is the YZ plane. And I'm going to begin by using this midline of the body. This is already here. It's based on the shape that we created. So I'm going to use create, project include, and project, which is also P on the keyboard, to bring that directly into my sketch. So this is going to be a part that we use, and then I'm just going to make sure that I stay underneath this edge on the car. This front piece here is basically a straight line, and I'm going to use that to my advantage. So I'm going to select that projected edge, and I'm just going to simply draw a line until about where the transition starts. I'm going to select the green check mark to OK that, and then I'm going to move on to creating a spline. Now, we should note that we could use an arc. So for example, we could figure out where this is, and we could just use an arc, and that would be relatively clean. And then we can fillet this. If you're working on a design that just can't be an arc, it just doesn't work, then you might need to use a spline for the rest of that geometry. Either option is going to be fine. It really just is going to depend on the curvature that you're working with. For this, because the arc does seem to work, I'm going to use that. It's a bit cleaner. And then I'm going to come back and just create a fillet in this corner to visually get that rounding that we would get. The radius value doesn't matter really. Again, it's important to note that we're making a concept. We're not focusing on trying to exactly match everything in the blueprint. We're going to make it look like a 911, and nobody's going to really be able to tell that it's not a perfect replica. If you spend your time trying to get every little detail right, it's going to take a lot of time. It's going to take hours and hours and hours to try to match all these little details. And that's perfectly fine, but honestly, it's not worth the hassle. For a concept like this, we're not staying true to form, so it's not worth the hassle. But we're going to make a spline on this back edge, and I'm going to put a couple points here to help control the curvature, and then I'm going to connect it back to here and hit the green check mark. Then I'm going to have tangency between this edge here, and notice that it moves the arc down. So we want to use Control Z to undo that. We don't want to bring the arc down. What we want is the spline to adjust based on that. So let's try tangent again. Select the arc first and then the spline, and notice that it adjusts the spline. We're going to do the same thing down here, but because this is a projected reference, it's not going to be able to move it at all. Once we apply that, we can hit escape, and then we can start tweaking the spline. So you might find that you don't need as many control points as you thought. But again, what we're going to do is we're going to get reasonably close to matching what the Porsche is, but it's not going to be critical that it's exact. I want it to be visually similar, but again, I'm not going to kill myself trying to get it exact because it will never be perfect, and I can tell you that. The last thing that I want to do is I'm going to take this projected edge. I'm going to find where the constraint is that is visible here, and I'm going to hit delete. Select it and hit delete. It's going to convert it to a polyline. You can see that it's got a bunch of vertices here. And then we're going to use trim. And the reason I want to use trim is because I want to get rid of the section that is outside of it. And it's going to tell us that some constraints are going to be deleted. That's fine, but I just want to get rid of those. So now what I have is this complete closed profile. If we hide the main body, what we should see is a closed profile that we can select. We're going to be using this for a surface, so it doesn't necessarily have to be completely closed, but because we're going to be extruding a surface, if it's not closed, it will only cause you trouble downstream. So if you cannot select this profile, then you want to spend a little bit more time making sure yours is right. Now that the body is hidden, I'm going to take this opportunity to make some slight adjustments. And then I want to make sure that I don't have any extra geometry down here. So you can see that we've got a little bit extra here. I'm going to use trim, and notice that it's not actually allowing me to trim anything. And this can be problematic, so we do want to make sure that we connect these two. I'm going to use coincident. You can see that it failed to solve, but as long as we have this closed profile and we don't have any extra hanging out here, then we should be okay. That little bit is not going to cause us a problem only because we can select this closed profile. So once again, spend as little or as much time here as you want. As long as it roughly matches the shape, we're going to be fine. The next thing that we're going to do is finish that sketch. I'm going to bring the body back, and I'm actually going to hide the wheels. We don't need to see them. It's just going to add extra complexity, and we don't need to see the canvas right now either. I'm going to go to surfaces, and I'm going to extrude. I'm going to take this and extrude it all the way out in both directions. I'll just use symmetric. Make sure that it goes all the way through the car, and then hit OK. Now, I mentioned before that there are several different ways that we could do this. Extruding a surface like this has a couple different benefits. But another way that we could go about this is by using that sketch as either a split line. So we could go to modify and split face. And if we use split face, what's going to happen is it's going to break up any faces that it intersects. So for example, it's going to automatically extend it out, and then it's going to just divide the faces up. If I say OK, you can see now I have these faces here. The problem with that is from here, what we would need to do is, I just did a Control Z to undo, but from here, what we would need to do is offset that in, or we would need to untrim it and then move it in. So it adds a couple extra steps. Another thing that we could do is split body. Now, split body does help because we can split the entire body. We can select our split tool. And what this does is it actually turns these windows into their own surfaces. So we've got the main body and we've got the two windows. Now, this is actually perfectly valid, but again, it adds a couple extra steps, and I'll show you why. So Control Z to undo, and let's bring this back. So the reason that we used this as opposed to just the sketch is because we're going to offset those windows inward. So we're going to go to Modify, Split Body. The body to split is going to be our main body. The splitting tool is our extruded surface. You notice that we can extend the splitting tool if it didn't go all the way through the body, but in this case, we extruded it all the way out. We're going to say OK. So now we've got the main body, which we can hide temporarily. We've got our extrude, and then we've got these window surfaces. So the reason that this is important is because now we can use these window surfaces to trim our extrude. And then instead of offsetting them because it'll be normal to the curvature, we're simply going to move them inward. Because the windows never line up perfectly with the outside of the body, we need to move them inward to give the appearance that we've got that extra thickness that the glass is set into the door. And then we can add additional trim if we want to. So what we're going to do from here is we're going to simply say trim. The trim tool is going to be this surface, and then we're simply going to get rid of everything on the outside of it. Using my right-click marking menu in the 12 o'clock position, I'm going to repeat trim. This is my trim tool, and I'm going to remove everything outside of it. Now that we have those pieces of glass, what we want to do is use Move Copy. Now you can use M on the keyboard, or you can go down to Move Copy. We're going to move bodies. We're going to select the window body that we want to move. The coordinate system should be in line with the default origin, so you can see that X is in line with this direction. And then we're simply going to move that window inward whatever amount we feel is needed. In this case, I'm going to say minus 10 millimeters, which is going to be very minor. We're going to repeat that, but this time we're going to move the other body, and it's going to go in a positive 10 millimeters. Now that we've moved it inward, we can use that same surface as a trim again. So we're going to say trim. This is our trim tool, and we want to get rid of this. But here is the kicker. When we trim this, it's going to get rid of everything on the other side. So how do we maintain surfaces on both sides? Well, we either need to create a copy of this extrude surface, or we need to split it in the middle, or we need to just use split body. So split body is sort of a go-to if trim isn't going to be the right tool, because then we can split this body and we can use this as our splitting tool. But you do want to make sure you select the entire surface, not an individual face. And we'll say OK. What that'll allow us to do is it'll allow us to break up this body. You can see that it left that little piece there, and the rest of it is left over here. So we can repeat the process using split body, or this time we could use trim. And that's simply because we can now trim it because we already broke off the other section. It gets a little tricky based on the selection because sometimes it doesn't seem to work, but you might just have to move around and select a different area. So that looks pretty good. This section down here doesn't look like it has tangency, but it's probably going to be good enough for what we need. And the last thing that I want to do is I want to stitch these together. So I'm going to stitch the window glass and that little trim piece, and I'm going to repeat the process on the other side, the window glass and that little trim piece, and say OK. Now, you might be thinking, why didn't we just stitch them to the main body? Well, the reason we didn't do that is because maybe you want to split it up later and leave the rear glass in place, or maybe you decide that you want to do some renders with the windows down. It can be helpful to have these be separate bodies. So that way we can just decide later if we want to put it all together. So I'm going to call this left-hand LH glass, and I'm going to call this right-hand glass. So that way I kind of remember what they are. So now if we look at this, if I hide edges, you can see that it looks like the glass is inset that 10 millimeters. It has a little bit of a step right here. Again, we could go back to the original sketch and we could make sure that that tangency is held true. And everything should update if we do that. So Control and 6 to bring my edges back, go back to sketch 4. I'm going to go ahead and edit sketch 4. And you can see here that the tangency looks like it might have been lost. So what we can do is we can try to get that tangency back. We can finish the sketch. And theoretically, everything should still work fine. It should have updated that as long as our sketch and our extruded surface didn't cross over another face. So for example, as long as it didn't go down into this part of the door, the updates should all be fine. So that's the general process that I like to use to create the glass, and that's true for the rear glass and the windscreen. The main thing that we need to think about is the direction in which the glass is being cut, and if it makes sense for us to do that extrude. Because again, if we use things like offsets, it's going to be normal to the curvature of the surface, so it's not going to offset it inward, where with the glass, what we really want to do is we just want to move it inside. So I'm going to move on to do the same thing with the front, but let's do a quick save, make sure we don't lose anything. So the front glass is actually a little bit trickier because, again, we adjusted the roof to make it flatter. You can see that it still is not perfectly in line with what we would expect. And the other trick to the front is the fact that if we are just to extend something out, it's going to cut through the front and the rear. And unlike the side glass, the front and the rear are not the same shape or in the same position. So it gets a little tricky. If you need to make any additional adjustments to the roof of the car, now would be the time to do it before you create this geometry. For us, I'm going to leave it as is. I think it looks pretty close and I'm okay with it. And again, this is a concept, so I'm not super concerned with it. But I do want to make sure that I use this edge as my upper windscreen rather than using the blueprint. And another thing I want to be mindful of is the edge that we use to cut the glass from the front, you can see is parallel, or it seems to be parallel, with this edge here. And again, instead of using the blueprint, I'm going to use this as my defining edge for the A-pillar. So let's create a sketch. We're going to do this on the front plane, which is XZ. And I'm going to start by using P on the keyboard to project. I'm going to bring this edge in, and I'm going to bring this edge in. I'm going to say OK. I'm also going to use my line tool, which is L on the keyboard, and I'm going to make a vertical line that goes all the way up to that. Hit escape. If you can't see that, you can always hide your canvases. You can hide the main body. I'm going to go ahead and hide the side glass as well. And this is going to be construction. So remember, you can use X on the keyboard, or you can simply select it over here in the palette. So now we've got the upper section of the windscreen, and we've got part of the A-pillar. So now is the time that we want to offset those inward. It might be helpful to see the canvas so we can kind of decide how far in we want to go. But again, we're doing this visually, so it's really going to be up to you. So I'm going to select offset. I'm going to grab this and simply pull it down. And it looks like about 25 millimeters is going to give me about the right shape. For the bottom section of the windscreen, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my line tool. I'm going to pick about where that is, and I'm going to draw a horizontal line out to the left. I want to convert that to construction, and I'm going to use that to help define tangency. And it's important that we have this reference here. You can see it's perpendicular to our vertical line. And that means when we mirror something across to the other side, it's going to be perfectly smooth at that mirror line. So that's going to be very important. We're going to go to Create, 3-point arc. I'm going to start here. I'm going to come over to about where the curvature would change and make sure that we have tangency there. Hit Escape to get off the arc tool. This is essentially a straight line. So what I'm going to do is use my line tool, and I want to carry this down. And we're going to maintain tangency. And then I want to bring this arc over, and I want to connect these 2 points. So again, what we're doing here is we're snapping these together. This arc has tangency at the center line where we're going to mirror. And now what I want to do is I want to create a fillet there. I want to round that corner. And we can decide how big or how small that needs to be. 15 millimeters looks like it's going to be okay. And then we'll hit Enter to OK the fillet. And now we need to mirror some of that. So mirror, remember that the upper section and this A-pillar portion was offset. So theoretically, if we select this edge, that small straight section, this fillet that was created, and this arc, we should be able to mirror those across, and we should get a closed profile. So once again, if you can select inside of the closed profile, you know that everything is connected. If not, then you need to do a little bit more work to make sure that all your points are connected. But now we have our windscreen. So we can finish our sketch. I'm going to hide the canvases, bring back the main body, and then we want to extrude this forward. So we're going to only go forward, and we're going to only go until it extrudes outside of the windscreen. Again, if we were to use something like trim or split body, it's going to extend out in both directions, and it's going to end up splitting this big clean back surface, and that's not something we want to do. So now we can use this again the same way as a split body tool. Bodies to split is the main body. Our splitting tool is this surface. We don't need to extend it out. If we do that, it's going to extend it all the way through the back, and we don't want that. So we're going to use just the extruded surface, and we're going to say OK. Now we can trim. Using the split body, we can get rid of this front section of the windscreen. And then we can use Move Copy. Again, that's M on the keyboard. We can move the new body that was cut, the glass. So we need to find that. It's going to be this original main body. And we need to select a distance to move it back. So 50 is probably a bit too much. Let's try 25. And you want to look at this from the side. You want to see what appears to be realistic. Now, when we move it back 25, that seems to be a bit too much as well. I'm just going to go 10 millimeters, the same as we did for the side. And I'm going to say OK. Now, theoretically, if we hide this, we should have an extrude. Might be kind of hard to see. This extrude that connects to our A-pillars. So now what we want to do is take that offset, and we want to trim this extrude. So let's hide the main body. And you can see here now we've got that small section. We can trim or split body. Either are going to be fine, but the trim tool is going to be this, and then we want to get rid of everything behind it. So once again, what we've done is we've created this little offset that's going to help us seal off the windscreen. You can see here everything's sealed off. Now that we have surfaces, we can come back and we can add fillets in the corners if we want them. But what I'm going to do first is I'm going to stitch everything together. So this is a case where I'm never going to do a render without the glass. So I'm just going to connect it to the main body. And assuming we have green edges, then everything looks good. Those will all be connected. And now if we want to, we can come back with a modify fillet and we can round off these inner corners. We could have, of course, done this with the sketch itself. Sometimes it's easier to do it afterwards with the surface. And we can pull that in and just round it off a little bit. 10 millimeters will be fine. I'm not going to spend a ton of time trying to make sure that all of my sharp edges are gone. Because honestly, again, that's one of those little details. If you're doing a very close-up render, then you might want to create a profile and sweep it all the way around the windscreen, and that'll give you the appearance of like chrome trim or black trim or something like that. I don't really feel it's necessary for this concept work because you can really spend hours and hours and hours of time trying to get all those little trim details right. And it kind of goes well beyond the bulk of the work that we need to do. So we've got the front glass inset now. We've got the sides and they're individual so we can show or hide them when we want. We still have some more trim to do there that we're going to take care of, but we have a little bit more to do there. But now let's take care of the back glass. Before we do, once again, make sure that we save. For the back glass, I'm going to do this from the top. I'm going to bring back my canvases. You can see this blueprint actually has a sunroof on it. We're not going to do the sunroof. We're going to leave the complete top as is, but we want to create this back glass. So I'm going to create a sketch on my top plane. I'm going to rotate it around so that it's horizontal. It's a bit easier for me to work with this way. And I want to begin by creating some lines. So I'm going to start with a line from the origin. It doesn't have to be from the origin. You could simply create a line out here that was coincident with the origin, but for me, sometimes it's easier just to draw all these lines as references. I'm going to make sure that they're construction. So again, X on the keyboard, or you can do it over here in the sketch palette. Then I'm going to create, again, some reference lines that'll help give me that perpendicular, or in this case, vertical relationship. Those will be construction as well. So again, X on the keyboard. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create some arcs. Now, I know that this isn't just a straight line, so I'm going to create some arcs, and I want to make sure those arcs are tangent with this perpendicular line. And the reason that I need those to be tangent is I want to make sure that when I mirror these, that the mirror is smooth across the middle. So make sure that you do have those tangencies. And then we're going to bring this all the way to the corner. We could offset this edge. It looks fairly straight. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a straight line and just make sure that it looks parallel. Again, visual references or visual cues are going to be more important for us than to perfectly match the blueprint. So we're going to take that, we're going to add some fillets in the corners, make them whatever size appears to be right. 37.5 looks okay to me. So I'm going to hit enter to okay the fillet. Then I'm going to mirror those. So we need to take both arcs, the arcs for the fillets and that straight line on the side, select one of our mirror lines and say okay. And once again, what we should see if we hide the main body is we should be able to select that complete closed profile. So that's going to give us the exact same thing. I'm going to extrude that up until it goes all the way through the body. You can bring the main body back if you need to see. And this is going to be our reference. So hide the canvases, split body. And again, this is one of those cases where we could just have used the original sketch to split the body, but because we're offsetting or we're moving the glass that we're cutting, having this extruded surface is actually pretty helpful because the extruded surface is going to be used for that little offset portion of our windscreen. So splitting tool is going to be this surface, and we're going to say okay. Then once again, we're going to trim. This is my trim tool. Get rid of everything above it. We're going to use M to move copy. Now, notice if I select the surface, the pivot point is going to be based on the actual surface, the curvature of the surface. But if I select it over here in the browser, the pivot point is going to be based off of my coordinate system. So that's one thing you want to make sure you do, because we're going to be moving it completely vertical. So it's going to be -10. Now the back windscreen is actually set in pretty far on these, so we could go further, like -15, and it's probably visually still going to be okay. Another thing that we could do, if you don't want to just have that hard vertical edge, we could get a little bit more creative. So for example, we could go to offset. We could select this body and we could offset it inward. Let's say -5 millimeters. Let's go a little bit more extreme so we can tell. Let's say -10 millimeters. With -10 millimeters, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide the main body so we can see what we did. What we're going to do now is we're going to use this offset to trim away the moved glass, and then we're going to loft between the main body and this. So we're going to go to trim. My trim tool is going to be that new offset, and what I want to get rid of is that little sliver, that little piece there. So now I've got this extrude that we don't need. I've got my main body. Let's go ahead and hide this extrude as well. So now we've got a gap between our main body, but the reason that we did this is because when we look at it from the top, now the glass and the opening are perfect offsets of each other. And the reason that we could do something like this is now we could loft between them. Now, when we do a loft between them, I'm going to use chain selection, and I'm going to go from the entire upper chain to the entire bottom chain, and I'm going to go ahead and stitch those together. So again, the reason why we would do something like this is if we didn't want the glass to be offset completely vertical, if we wanted to maintain a small angle there. We could always come back and do something like a fillet on this corner. We could do something very small, like 5 millimeters. It would probably work. It's not necessary. Again, it really just depends on the car and the geometry you're working with. But sometimes using things like a loft can help us get those transitions look a little bit more realistic. Let's do a quick save. All right, so let's do a quick recap of what we've done. So we've cut out the side glass. We cut out the front and the back glass. We moved them, or we set them in a little bit so it gives us that realism that we're looking for. And we stitched the front and the rear glass together. We kept the side separate. We kept the left and the right hand separate in case we want to split them up later and do renders where they're maybe open. If you want to spend the time to do a full interior and put seats in this thing, then it can be kind of nice for you to get rid of the glass, give it a little bit more realism. So there's really no direct, let's see what I'm trying to say. There's really no sort of next step that has to be followed. There's a lot still left to do. We have to do trim, and we have to do the seams. We have to do the headlights. We have to do openings in the bumper. There's a lot of little pieces left to be done. So the next step for me that I would like to do is I'd like to add a little bit more realism to the glass on the side, because this car has a fixed triangle window up front. And then it has the glass that slides down into the door. And then it has these two pieces, which, again, there's trim for the glass. These are guides for the glass. And then I believe the rear glass actually might roll down in these cars. I know I had an old 68 Camaro where the rear triangle glass actually would roll down into the quarter. And I think the Porsche does as well, but I'm not sure. I've never owned one of these cars. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add those bits to make them a little bit more realistic. So we're going to do that by creating a sketch. We're going to do this on the side plane. I am going to hide the main body, and we're going to get rid of some of these other bodies that we don't need in a little bit, but I'm going to hide the main body because all I really need is the outside profile of this thing. So what I want to do is I want to project that. We could use the original sketch. So if we know which sketch it was, I think it was sketch 4, we could simply project that entire sketch, or we could use it. So let's go ahead and use P on the keyboard to project, and we're going to bring in either this sketch, or we can simply select an entire face or a body that we want. So If we select these two bodies, you can see that it brings in some of the midlines, or you can select the sketch. It really doesn't matter. I'm going to go ahead and delete those middle pieces, just select them and delete them. But now I've got the upper and the lower sections. So I'm just going to use my line tool, and I'm going to simply just draw a line that looks like it is roughly in line. And then I'm going to make a parallel line. I'm going to do the same thing back here and draw another one. I'm going to make them parallel. And again, this is just going to add a little bit more realism. It's not necessarily required or needed, but it does help us with the realism a little bit. All of them are parallel. If we want to, we can use D on the keyboard and dimension them so that they are the same. I'm just going to select this dimension to link them together. And again, we can do the same thing up here just to make sure that they all look consistent. So now that we have these three pieces, what we need to do is, well, first off, let's get rid of the canvas. It makes it really hard to see. But we're going to extrude them as solids. They could be surfaces if you wanted them to. Honestly, it just depends on what you're doing. If you want to make them surfaces, what you're going to end up doing is splitting this and then offsetting them forward and stitching them together. But it's probably just quicker and easier to do them as solids. So I'm going to start with extrude, and I'm going to select all three of these. I'm going to start them from an object. So when I go from an object, I'm going to select the left-hand glass, but notice that nothing's happening because it wants an individual face to start at. So when we do this option, it's not going to give us the best result because we can't select the entire thing. So a way that we can get around this is by actually going to offset this. Instead of using object, just use offset. And what we want to do is we want to offset at a certain amount, let's say 1,000 millimeters. And then we're going to go to an object. And that object we're going to go to is the glass. And then we're going to use this offset amount of 10 millimeters. Let's try -10. And it says it can't complete the extrusion. So what happens when we get in a case like this is sometimes the dimensions are too big, or sometimes the values that we're trying to use aren't working. The easiest way to make this happen is to go back when we had that original offset glass before we moved it and make a copy of it. But that's not always possible. Sometimes it just doesn't work. So we're going to simplify this a little bit. We're going to do just a single edge. We're going to go from an offset, and we're going to go to an object. Now, if we do 0 millimeter offset and to an object, you can see that it's still not working. So let's try this. Let's go from the profile plane. Let's go to an object, and let's go 10 millimeters. Now, when we add the 10 millimeters and we're going up to this object, it's not working for two reasons. Well, for one main reason. It's not working because of this right here. Because this is stitched to the rest of it, it just absolutely does not like it. So the way that we have to get around that is by selecting an individual face, but then you can see that it's missing the stuff down here because it doesn't actually know what's supposed to happen there. So the easiest way for me to make this work is to create an offset. So I'm going to offset this 10 millimeters. So we're going to go -10. And then you'll notice that it doesn't actually extend in the proper place at the bottom. And the reason it doesn't is because we didn't offset it before, we just moved it. So we can extend the entire thing out and just move it out an additional 5 or 10 millimeters. It really doesn't matter as long as it extends past where you need it to cut. The other option that we could do is to create an offset like we did of this, but make it 0 millimeters. And the reason we make it 0 millimeters is now we can use modify, move copy, and we can move it forward the 10 millimeters that we need to go. So this gives us the complete outside section. So the way that we work with it now is we can create our solid extrude, and we can extend it out to this surface, and then we can split the body with the inside surface. The other way that we could do it is with surfaces, and again, we can split this and we can sort of patch them together. So how you do this really depends on geometry. And I know I say that a lot, but there are some cases where the geometry is going to dictate which way you need to go. Because I had to create this offset and move it, and now I have the outside, the easiest method is going to be to extrude these as surfaces. And I'm going to go ahead and grab all of these vertical lines, and I'm going to bring them out. And the reason that this is the easiest method is because we already have the containing surface on the top and the containing surface on the outside. So this gives me all the little pieces I need. So we can use modify and split body or trim. So the bodies to split are going to be all of these extrudes. So I'm going to select each individual one. And I'm going to select these. And then my splitting tool is that offset, that move that we just created. So this is going to give us all of these little pieces, these little surfaces that we don't need. So we're going to find where they are. We're going to select them. So you might need to move the cursor down until you find which ones are the correct ones. So it looks like these two here. And I'll also go back to these other extrudes that we don't need anymore. I'm going to right click and select remove. Remove is important and not delete. The reason remove is important is because it puts something in the timeline for us, where delete will try to get rid of everything that's associated with it. And that's not exactly what we want. So now that we have the sort of outside section of where these trims are, now we can use them to break up the rest of this. Now, this is where a tool like a mutual trim would come in really handy, but unfortunately Fusion doesn't have that. So we can't necessarily use trim. We can use it in some cases, but we can't use it in all cases. So I'm going to start with trim. My trim tool is going to be this surface, and then I'm going to remove the outside section here. So I'm going to repeat that. A trim tool is this back surface, and then I can get rid of this outside. Now, that works on the outside pieces, but it doesn't work on the inside pieces, and that's just simply because we need to leave the rest of the surface for other things. So we're going to have to use split body. We could also use split face and then delete them, but split body seems to work. So bodies to split and splitting tools. So here I'm going to select multiples, all the ones that we need, and say OK. So you can see it gives me an error, but it was able to try to split this, but you can see that it didn't actually work. So let's try it again. Split body, bodies to split, and my splitting tool. Let's go ahead and just use one, and you can see that it's still not able to split that. So if you run into this, likely what's happening is there might be a very small section where it's not able to extend through. Another thing that we can do is when we're using split body and we're using our split tool, we can simply select extend and allow it to go all the way through. So let's try that again. Bodies to split. Make sure we select this. Our splitting tools, let's go ahead and try all of these. Say OK. And now you can see it broke up all those little pieces. So we find the surfaces we don't need. So we don't need that little section. We can remove it. This section here, we don't need that. We can remove it. And what that left us with, if we hide our left-hand glass, is it left us with ends that have capped off all these little pieces. So hopefully you can start to see why creating a solid extrude would have been a lot quicker if it had worked up to our surface selections. But again, this is still possible. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go to trim. And the trim tool is going to be this right here. And then what we're going to remove is all of these back sections that we don't need. So this one's pretty easy. We can select all these little pieces. We can say OK. And it should get rid of all the back pieces of the surfaces. So at this stage, we have to decide, do we want this to be a part of our glass, or are we going to just make these their own bodies? Now, if we're going to make them their own bodies, it's going to involve us splitting this back glass, making copies, and stitching them together. We can leave them as just surfaces and just apply appearances to them. Any of those options will be fine. For me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch the little pieces together. I'm going to rotate this around. I'm going to stitch those together. I'm going to repeat the process and do the same thing over here. If you ever need to select through something, what you can do is you can hold down the left mouse button. So for example, over here, I could hold down the left mouse button. Let's go ahead and hold down the left mouse button, and then it can show you which little pieces are available for your selection. So now that I have those pieces, because I need to repeat this on the other side, I'm going to just leave them as is, and I'm going to mirror them. I'm going to make sure that I mirror them as bodies. It's going to be these 3 pieces, and then the mirror plane will be right in the middle, and it'll simply put them on the other side. If you want to go the next step and actually trim things out, then what you would want to do is use this as a trim tool and get rid of that little section, or you could use them to split the body. And again, it really just depends on what you're trying to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename these W Trim 1, and I'm going to rename each of them W Trim 2. So that way when I'm applying appearances, it's going to be easier for me to tell what these are. W Trim 3, and we'll do the same thing on the other side, 4, 5, and 6. So again, it's important to note that when we're doing concepts like this, if we're not modeling stuff for manufacturing and we're only modeling it for visual appearances, then we can sort of, I guess, fake it. You know, we don't have to have it perfect. We can sort of make these little adjustments so that way we can sort of get it to look right without having to spend all of that time. All right, so at this point, things are looking pretty good. I mean, we're getting a lot of those little details, but hopefully it's not getting too much at this point, but hopefully you're starting to realize that it does take a good bit of time. And sometimes the method you try to use is not going to work, like extruding the solids up to this window didn't work. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. It's going to depend partially on whether or not your sketch completely sits inside that surface, if you're trying to use multiple profiles and all these different little things that can sort of cause those problems. There are plenty of other little bits that we need to do to this. This is a good time for us to save and think about the next steps. So for me, what I want to think about is, do I want this body kit to be smooth and blended into the rest of the car, or do I want it to look like it was sort of stuck on? And how do I want the rest of the body to look? How do I want the openings in the bumper to look? How do I want all those extra pieces? We also need to think about things like the headlight. We have a scoop that we need to make on the hood, and we need to have the opening for the engine bay, and we have a spoiler, and we've got the tail lights in the Aero. We've got all these little bits that need to happen. So there are a lot of extra steps that we need to do for the rest of the car. But the first thing that I want to start to think about is the body kit. All right, I'm not going to worry about the openings in the front end just yet. I need to think about where they actually split. So if we take a look at the original car and the blueprints, you can see that the bumper splits right here. The original body is just below the headlight, and it comes to about here. So when we think about body kits, they're going to split in the exact same place that the OEM car did. Now, you can see that the side skirt splits below the door. We're going to have to deal with a door seam. And on the rear, you can see that the bumper actually comes up here. So there's a piece that comes further back here, and then it could split down low. I'm probably not going to follow the same lines for the rear because we did put our tail light in a very different spot. You can see on the blueprint, the original tail light is like up here, and the bumper was down here, but I put it much lower. Probably not anywhere close to legal in any state, but again, we're making a concept and we're adjusting things as we see fit. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to break up the front. So I'm going to go to a sketch. Again, we're going to just use these default planes, and this is actually going to be pretty straightforward. So I'm just going to create a rectangle, and the rectangle is going to represent the height of the seam that we're going to create. So I want to figure out how wide this needs to be. And while I don't need to dimension it, I'm going to, because I'm going to try to keep the gaps fairly consistent. And I'm going to say 10 millimeters. 10 millimeters is going to be the default seam that I'm going to use. So I want to find about where that needs to be. And that looks okay. and we're going to finish the sketch. Now this gets a little tricky. The reason this gets a little tricky is because when we split this up, it's not going to work like the headlight. It's not going to work like the windscreen or the side glass or the rear glass, because we can't just use this extrusion to sort of fix the rest of it, right? Because if we create an offset, for example, if we offset it, it's going to be normal to the curvature, so that's not going to work. And also, we need to think about things like this tiny little face right here is going to be right underneath where that sketch is. And sometimes those little things can be very problematic. Back here, we're very close to this point, so if this edge was a little bit higher, we'd leave a tiny little triangle there. These are all things that we should be mindful of because they're going to affect our selection. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Modify, Split Body. Body to split is the main. The tool is this rectangle, and it's extended. So if we rotate this around, it's actually extending it all the way out. And what we've done here, if we hide the canvases, is we split the body up. Now, the first way that you can fake seams, body seams, would be to just simply change the color of this. Now, if your renders are far away, then that usually is enough. You can just either make it a little bit darker color of the body, or you can make it black. And sometimes that's enough to sort of give you that effect. If we just hide this, you can see that we can't just leave it open, because obviously that is going to show everything inside. So one of the options that we do have is to try to scale this down a little bit. Now, it's not the best option, but sometimes it can work. Another option that we have is to try to create a sweep. So I think in this case, that's going to be the best option because of the orientation. So what I want to do is I'm going to go to Create, Project Include, and Intersect. And I want to intersect these two edges. I want a reference here. And what I'm going to do is use my line tool. I'm just going to draw a straight line back, up, and back to here. And that is going to be used for a sweep. So I'm going to select Sweep. I'm going to select my profile. And instead of single path, I'm going to use Path and Guide Rail. So for my first path, it's going to be this upper section. But notice that when we use chain selection, that it's trying to go all the way around the car. So we want to turn off chain selection, and we want to manually figure out where we need this to go. Again, be mindful of those little pieces. So if you have any small selections, and then we can carry that all the way back. And then the second guide rail is going to be here. And again, be mindful of those small selections. If it doesn't let you select it, probably means that there is a very small sliver there and you need to work your way around. Again, I don't know why these selection dialogues are always in the way, but now what we have is a sweep that represents half of that seam. So we're going to go to Create, Mirror. We're going to mirror that body and then mirror it across our middle plane. We're going to select Join, which should join it together with the other side. So now we have that trim. And what I like to do is I like to keep things like the bumper and the body separate, but I do want to add the trim to one of them. It makes it a little bit easier for me. So if you decide that you want the trim to be a different color, for example, you were going to make it gray or black, then you would want to make sure that you keep it separate. It'd be easier that way. But for simplicity's sake, I'm going to stitch the bumper and that trim together. So that way, if I decide to, say, hide the bumper, then I have the car and it doesn't look realistic because the trim isn't there. But if we isolate the bumper, then you can see that I can work on just the bumper alone. I can hide all the rest of everything else. And it just kind of helps break up the body. Now, if we hide our edges using Control and 4, now you can see that we've got a seam. It gives us a little bit more realism. It looks like we've got a removable bumper. It goes in the factory location, and everything is sort of working as expected. So that's a good start. Again, let's make sure that we do save it. And anytime we make a drastic change, we want to make sure that we save it. I'm also going to rename this front bumper. All right, in the back, again, my taillight is is really low, but I'm going to follow the same procedure. I'm going to sketch on the side. I'm just going to use a rectangle. I'm not going to be using the blueprint this time because, again, our bumper is a little bit different. But I just want to break it up. And again, we're looking visually at consistency. So I'm going to make it 10 millimeters. And I want to pull it down so that it breaks up the body about in this corner. We could go back to the form and we could spend more time to tighten up this corner. Again, it's not really worth it. So we're going to use modify, split body, bodies to split, splitting tool. Now this one works out a little bit different. We could use sweep if we wanted to. We could just offset this, or we could scale it down a little bit. So these are all valid options. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to scale it down, but the one on the other side, so we've got one on the left side and we've got one on the right side. I'm going to remove the one on the right side simply because we're going to make some adjustments to one of them and I don't want to have to do it twice. So next I'm going to try to use modify and scale. The entity that I want to scale is that little piece there, and then I need to figure out if I'm going to scale it down uniform or what we're going to do. So I'm just going to try to hit 0.99 and scale it down and say OK. And you can see that it gives me the appearance of that little seam there. Now, when we do this, we need to still connect it back to the car body. And you'll notice that when we scaled it down, it didn't really move anywhere. So we want to use modify, move copy. We're going to select that and we're just going to move it in minus, let's say 2 millimeters, give a very minor seam there. And then we need to connect them together. So we're going to do this with loft. This case, I'm going to try to use chain selection and see if it'll work, but you can see it's going all the way around again. So I'm going to manually do this. So we're going to rotate around and I'm just going to work my way around the bumper. Because we're not really going that far, it shouldn't take that long. It's just a couple of selections. And I'm going to go all the way in here. And then we're going to add another profile, and we're going to do that on the bottom here. It's going to work my way around. Because it wants to connect these as a chain by default, you shouldn't have to worry about zooming way far in unless you have a very small segment. And we're going to say OK to that. And then we need to repeat the process on the top. And the reason we need to do this is because if we ever have a render at an angle, you would be able to see inside of that gap, and that's not what we want. It really ruins the realism. So again, we're just going to kind of work our way around. Select this and that. Also, if you make a selection that is not connected to that original edge, it'll automatically make another profile for you. But you can see that it's starting to create a preview, and sometimes that becomes problematic when it's starting to create a preview because it can give you warnings that it's trying to connect the two and there's a gap or something like that. So sometimes it's just easier to hit the plus and make a new profile because then the preview isn't really a problem. All right, so now that we have that, I want to hide the main body and I want to stitch all these together. And so that main sort of scaled offset, a tiny little sliver, which we might need to rotate this to see. That piece there, and then rotate it around and find the other piece. And I'm not going to connect it to the bumper just yet because I need to mirror it to the other side. So anything that we do, we're going to be mirroring. So again, just make sure that you're mindful of that, and then we can stitch them together. So the main bumper, and then this piece here and that piece there. And now those are both connected to the rear bumper. So now we can find the rear bumper, we can rename it. And then we've got the main body, the rear bumper, and the front bumper. And again, now we've got sort of that realism. We've got that little bit of a gap, and it looks like a seam. When we get into doing renders, it'll look a bit better, but you can see based on just this angle, we've got that that seam, that 10 millimeter gap that we created. So once again, let's do a save, make sure we don't lose anything. And let's repeat this process for the side skirt. For this, I'm going to bring the canvas back, Again, create another sketch. It's the same process over and over again. Once you sort of learn a handful of tools, it's just going to repeat itself over and over again. So what we're going to do is we're just going to create a split. We're going to go all the way through the fender, all the way through the side skirt. Going to make it 10 millimeters, just like everything else. And then we're going to split body. Now, this one is going to actually work out a bit better for us because instead of doing all the work of like lofting and stitching everything together, I'm going to take a shortcut and I'm just going to use move. We're going to move the that small sliver on the left side, which is going to be this one here. And I'm just going to move it in -4 millimeters. Now let's go a little bit more. Let's go -5 millimeters. And now you can see that it looks like it was offset inward. The one that's on the other side, once again, I'm going to remove because I'm only going to do the work once. And actually, we could remove the entire side skirt from the other side. And that way we can stitch everything to this bottom one and just mirror it to the other side. Another sort of nice feature is that when you're sort of working on these pieces individually, it gives you a lot of flexibility if you say want to, I don't know, create a couple different side skirts and try out different looks. If you have them as separate bodies, then you can do that very easily. You can just make some modifications to one and kind of see how it looks. So once again, if you just start to select a different edge that's not connected, it'll automatically make a new profile for you. But sometimes the preview can be problematic. So let's go ahead and find where that edge ends. Should be right there. And you'll note that the inside is sort of extended in because we did that move. But again, that's okay. You're not going to see anything in there. Then we're going to just do another loft. We're going to go from this one here. Again, working our way all the way around. I'm going to select that there, and this one should wrap all the way around. And again, if we do plus to create another profile, it's going to be a little bit easier for us because now we don't have to worry so much about some of those errors that pop up. You do still see a preview here, but I find that if you hit plus to create another profile, that sometimes it's just a bit easier on the calculations. All right, so now that we have those, let's go ahead and hide the main body. The main body number is dropping because we have less and less faces attached to it. So we're going to stitch this together. We're going to stitch all those little lofts that move. And now we can mirror that whole thing. So we're going to go to Create, Mirror, mirror this body, mirror it across that. And now we've got our left skirt, left hand skirt, and right hand skirt. So if we bring the main body back, you can see now it's starting to look a little bit more real. We've got these seams here, the seams on the side. We haven't done the door yet, but we've got the one on the back. We haven't taken care of the engine. There's some louvers there, so that's going to take a little bit of work. We haven't touched the wing yet, and we haven't done the hood. We haven't done the openings on the bumper, so there's still a lot of little bits that have to happen. But we're making progress, and the process is going to be very similar from here on out. But let's go ahead and save this before we move on to the next piece. Since we are looking at the side here, let's go ahead and just take care of the door. Now, the door is going to be probably one of the trickier sections. So what we want to do is we're going to start another sketch on the side. And because I already know that the window sort of lines up here, I'm going to use P on the keyboard to project. And I want to just take this vertex right here. Actually, you know what? I'm going to take this entire edge right there. And then I want to find the bottom of the A-pillar right here. So in reality, the A-pillar itself is going to open with the door. So this section here, the glass and everything would open with the door. We're not going to get down to that level of detail. So really all we're looking to do is we're looking to break up the door so that it looks more real. So I'm going to just bring in some of those references where those seams are going to hit. Once I have those references, I'm also going to take this reference here. But remember, this is a horizontal line. So all I really need to do is make sure that either I offset it or I take a horizontal line. So For me, since we know it's horizontal, I'm just going to start here. I'm going to draw a horizontal line until that arc starts. And then we can carry this with an arc. And we do that by going back to the last, the vertex, and just holding down the left mouse button. So that allows us to turn the line into an arc. So this is the starting point for the door. Now, this part looks to be straight, but it's not actually straight. So from here on out, I'm going to be using splines. I'm going to start here, and we actually don't need very many controls. I'm just going to put one in there and snap back to that line. Then I need to make sure that these are tangent. So I'm going to add that tangency and make sure that that looks pretty good. For the front, again, we're going to use a spline. It's a hard corner there, so again, I don't really need too many controls, but it does change directions up here. So we want to make sure that we do sort of match that shape. So we're going to do this by moving this vertex around. And if we find that it's not perfect, that's okay, because again, it's a concept. We just want to make it look about right. And that looks pretty good. So the way that we need to do this is we actually need to create an offset. And the offset's going to be tricky because when we offset this 10 millimeters or whatever we decide we want to do, it's not going to connect to this upper edge anymore. So we need to be just mindful of that. So as I pull this in, I'm going to go in 10 millimeters. That's what all of our other gaps are. We say okay. You can see that it doesn't connect here and it doesn't connect at the front. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to take a straight line, and my straight line, I just want to make sure that it has tangency. And I'm going to go to the front here. I'm going to take a straight line and I'm just going to carry it up, making sure that I have tangency. So what we should see is that intersection here is a complete closed profile. So if we hide the main body and we try to select it, you should see that it's an entirely closed profile. So this will make sure that we're attaching to a body line that we already have on the car and that we have a closed profile that we can use to split it up. So let's finish the sketch and let's figure out how we want to split the body up. So the way that I want to do this is by going to modify and split body. It seems to be my go-to tool. But when we do the body to split, we're going to select the entire body, not the side skirt, not the window. And then the splitting tool is going to be the sketch, but we need to select the profile. So we need to make sure that we do have a closed profile. And it's not going to work because of our projected references. So we're actually going to end up doing this twice. So you can see that it extends up and it's going to try to break the upper section of the car. So if we just say okay, it's going to break that upper section. So we need to turn off extend split tool and say okay, and notice it doesn't work. Now, the reason it doesn't work is because we don't have that closed profile. So in order to get the closed profile, let's go fix our sketch. We're going to go back into that last sketch, right click and edit. And what we want to do is we want to try to trim this. Now, unfortunately, trimming is not going to work on a projected edge. So we need to select it, find the projected constraint, and hit delete on the keyboard. Then we can come back and use trim to get rid of these extra little sections. Now, it is going to give you a warning. And you can see that this over here is still projected, so we need to, again, select and delete. Then we can use trim, and just make sure that what we're left with is this closed profile. Now, as long as you don't take any of these vertices and move them around, it should still be fine. You shouldn't have to worry about anything not aligning, but you just have to be careful not to move things around. Now let's try that again. Let's go to split body, bodies to split, and then our splitting tool now should select the entire thing. We can extend the tool out, and now we have our split. Now, if we did everything right, the split should line up here, and it should line up with the A-pillar, and visually should look okay. But we need to sort of offset it inward. We need to figure out how we can create that thickness. So the way that I'm going to do this is, one, I'm going to remove the one on the other side. And then the one I have here, again, I'm going to use move copy. I'm going to move it in a small amount. So it'll be minus, let's say 3 millimeters. Let's go all the way to 5. That's what we did for some of the other areas. And then we need a loft between. So the lofting part is actually going to take a good bit of time because of the selections. If we try to go to loft and we use chain selection, you can see that it's going all the way around the window, and that's not what we want. We don't want that entire opening. So we're gonna have to do it manually, and it's probably easier for us to hide some of the pieces. So we need to find which pieces we can hide. So let's hit escape to get off the loft tool. We've got the main body, but notice that the door is still connected to the main body. Now, if we want to disconnect the door, what we need to do is we need to unstitch it. Now, the way that we do that is we use this unstitch, and then we need to turn off chain selection, and we need to figure out the pieces that we want to unstitch. So if I select those pieces on both sides and say OK, theoretically, those pieces should be unstitched from the rest of the car. But you'll notice that the rest of the door pieces aren't. So if we do unstitch and we select all the other door pieces, go ahead and grab them on both sides, then we should see now that those door pieces are fine. Let's go ahead and hide the glass. Let's hide the front and rear bumpers. Let's hide the side skirts. We don't really need to see them right now. And we can hide all the window trim as well, as these are not going to be important to us. But what we do want is we want those little offset pieces, right? So those little pieces that we created, that we moved in, we need to connect the door to that. So we're going to do this with a loft. And again, chain selection is going to try to go all the way around. And you'll notice that these are all individual faces now. So once you untrim something, it's going to take those faces you selected and it's going to break them up into individual faces. So let's go ahead and stitch those back together. I don't really care about the other door because we're going to create this offset and we're going to mirror it to the other side. So I can just hide that entire thing. Then now we can finally go to loft. So we're going to come around here. We're going to work our way all the way around. Again, this can be time consuming depending on the number of edges you have, but it is going to be important. And then next, we're going to loft to this little seam here. Now you need to work your way around. Again, just making those selections. This should be a single edge here. We can rotate it around. And this edge here all the way up. And we'll have to do this with the body as well. And we'll come all the way up to here. And there might be a little tiny edge here. Make sure that we do grab that as well. And now you can see that we've got those pieces. I'm going to go ahead and stitch these three together right now. It does add an extra feature in the timeline, but it does simplify the number of things that we have to select. I'm going to bring back the main body, and we need to repeat that process to fill in the rest of this gap. And again, it won't be realistic if we try to create a render and you can see the ground through the door seam. So we're going to have to work our way around selecting each of these. And this does also help us. Let's go ahead and deselect that. This does help us because in some cases you might find that you can't loft the entire thing. You might find that you want to manually select certain entities. I'm going to rotate the car so we're looking at it from the inside. And for the second edge, I'm going to work my way around the inside. And sometimes this will be a little bit easier since we haven't created a floor or bottom to the car. Just going to work my way forward, find this edge, and we need to go all the way up. All right, so now that should theoretically fill in that gap. And we can stitch that last piece and the door together. So I'm going to select stitch with both selected, and then we can mirror the door. Whether or not you connect the door back to the rest of the car is up to you. It's going to kind of depend on if you, again, how much you really want to do with the inside of the car. I am not going to worry about that simply because I am not going to do anything with the interior of the car. So just keep in mind that depending on how far you want to go, you might decide that you want to just knit all this stuff back together. and that'll simplify the process of applying appearances and things like that. For me, there are a couple extra little pieces. So like this piece right here, I'm going to remove, just clean up the stuff. We've got the side skirts here, this body. These are all the other door, so I'm going to remove those. And I'm going to stitch the door, the main body, and this door together. I don't really want to worry about opening them up or anything like that. And actually for me, the glass, I'm going to go ahead and leave the glass for now, but probably not going to worry about doing anything special with the glass. Some of the things that will take your renders to the next level are including things like windshield wipers. Those kinds of details tend to take a good bit of time, and you really need to have a good reference. For this example, I am going to do the engine cover opening, and we will do some side view mirrors. I'm not going to do windshield wipers on this, but just note that you can. Okay, so a couple more things that we have to do. We have to have the scoop on the hood, and we also have to deal with splitting the hood up. So because the stock car has this sort of like intake here that goes up to the hood seam, what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw the gap for the hood first, and then I'm going to do this. So that way I've got a reference line. So I'm going to go ahead and split the hood up, but let's do a quick save. Then we're going to draw a sketch on the top. And again, I like to work with the car sideways. It seems to fit the screen a little bit better. And again, line. So I'm going to hit L on the keyboard. I'm going to start from the origin and just draw a line to where I want that reference. And I'm going to draw this all the way down to about here, hit escape to get off my line tool. And then I'm going to hit P to project this reference. And then I'm going to connect that line to it. Now, the reason I'm using this reference is because that's where the gap is for the bumper. Now, on the real car, the gap for the bumper and the hood, I believe, are the same. So you can kind of see in this reference are the same. Because we did it from the side view and not the top view, you can see ours is a little bit further forward because of the difference in curvature. But I'm just going to use that as my reference, and then I'm going to sort of build out the rest of this. So using the line tool again, I want that horizontal or perpendicular reference that I can use for a mirror. Then I'm going to create an arc. The arc will go from here out to wherever I want the hood to end. And again, we want tangency there. It can be kind of hard to see with the car. So if I hide the main body, what we should see is that we carry tangency across to that reference edge. Again, that's so when we mirror, we know that we've got a smooth transition. You can see the side skirts are visible here. Don't worry too much about that. One thing that we do want to be sure of is that we're not going to cross this line that was created on the car. I'm going to make sure that I stay inside of that a little bit. And for this right here, I'm going to go to that point, and I'm probably going to use a spline, but I'm going to use a spline with just a start and an end point. I'm going to hit escape to get off my spline tool, and then I'm going to control this with just the handles. I'm going to see if I can get close to that shape, and that actually looks pretty good. And once I'm happy with that, we're going to mirror it. So just this spline and this arc, we're going to select our mirror line. And then the mirror line itself, I'm going to make sure that's construction. And once again, we always want to make sure that we can select this closed profile to make sure that all the edges are clean. Now, we have to remember as well from the top that this shape needs to be offset, because we need to offset everything here in 10 millimeters. And you'll notice that when I do this, it's not letting me add to my selection. It's automatically just doing it over here. That's okay. We're going to bring this in 10 millimeters. Again, that's the gap that we used everywhere. And then we can just mirror that to the other side. And that should work just fine. But we do, again, we have to be careful of the front, because the front likely is not going to connect. So we will need to use some small lines and make sure those small lines are tangent. And we'll do the same thing over here. Just carry tangency, and then we'll get off our line tool. So we're going to have the same issue that we had with the door because we can't use this for a perfect sort of split body unless we sort of break the projection link on the front edge here. So once you find that, find the constraint, hit delete, and then we're going to use the trim tool. Now we will get an error here just because it's breaking some of the constraints. That's fine, but we want to trim everything. So what we're left with is we're left with this little section here. And again, the test for this is hide the body and see if you can select the inside of that. And what we want to see is that we've got the seam for the hood. The reason that this is important is because if we just were to extend these out, allow it to extend as a trim surface, it's going to try to also trim the side skirts, and we don't want that. So let's hide the canvases, let's finish our sketch, bring back the main body, and then let's do our split body. So bodies to split is going to be just the car body, and the split tool is here. But notice what's happening. It's automatically trying to go to here. That is not what I want. So what we're going to have to do is go back into that sketch one more time. And that original line that I placed up here, make sure that make sure that it's construction. Anything that we don't want to be used, make sure it's construction. All right, so let's try that one more time. Modify, split body, bodies to split, and our split tool. And what we want to do is we want to try to add all 4 sections. And what we should see if we look at this from the top is we should see all those sections selected and okay. Now, if everything worked okay, we should end up with the main body, and then we should end up with this a little like sliver piece right here. So that little sliver piece is what's going to give us our fake seam, essentially. So with it selected, we'll go to Modify, Move Copy. We're going to move it down in the Z direction. So I'm going to say -10 millimeters, and OK. So what that should do is it should take the front of it down pretty far. You can see it right here. And then the rest of it is sort of open. So I'm going to use the bumper to trim the front of this because I don't want to create a little gap that comes down here. So I'm going to use Trim. This is my trim tool. I want to get rid of that little piece there, and on the other side, that little piece. Now we can hide our front bumper and just see what we have left. You can see it left a little sliver piece there, and probably body 84 is also a little sliver piece. Let's see. So you can see it cut up some of the wheel wells. That's okay. Any of those little pieces that got cut on the inside are not going to be really important. What we want to do is we want to find those little sliver pieces and we want to get rid of them because we really don't need them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide the rear bumper, the side skirts, all the window trim, and the glass. And you can select multiple things, right click and show hide and hide them all at once. And then also this big piece here, that is going to be what we need to keep. And then the rest of this stuff here, we're going to select it. Notice that it grabs all of them here. We're going to right click and remove them. Now notice it's not allowing us to remove them. It just has delete. So I need to select them manually. I'm going to shift select those, control select that, and remove them. So now we're going to bring back this and the main body. We're going to start to connect these pieces together. There is one little sliver piece that's left here. If that happens, you can actually select the face and hit delete on the keyboard to delete a face. It doesn't work if you select an edge. It only works if you select a face. So if it's a tiny, tiny sliver face, it might be kind of tricky, but you might need to zoom in. See if you can select it as a face and delete it. And if not, we might just need to leave it there. So we could also extend our original sketch out further past this so that it does cut it properly. For me, I'm not too concerned with it. It's going to be fine because there is actually a seam for the front bumper that ends up right there. So it's not going to really be a big problem. But just note that if you do end up with something like that, if you can select it as a face, so down in the bottom right hand corner, it's telling us edge. If you change your selection priorities to face selection, and we do like a box select here, you can see that it's not actually grabbing a face here. It thinks that it wants this whole face here. So what happens is if you can't select it as a face, then you probably aren't going to be able to delete it. So what that means is we either extend our sketch curve out and we trim all the way through, or we just leave it as is. It's not really going to be a problem for us, so I'm just going to leave it. And I'm going to go to Create, Loft, and we're going to start here, work our way all the way around. And we'll select the back edge. This might be a case where chain selection actually works okay. So for the other edge, I'm going to try chain selection. I'm going to say plus. And note that it's trying to go all the way around, so it's not going to work in this case. And we're just going to work our way around just like we did for the upper edge. And find where the back edge is. We do need to make sure we're selecting the back edge of that little offset piece. Might need to rotate a bit. I know this is probably making some people motion sick. When you're working on stuff like this, you are going to have to zoom in and zoom out a bit. I don't tend to use a 3D mouse. I used to use them quite often, but it doesn't really work very well in videos. I think it tends to make people a little bit more sick. So I tend to just use the mouse wheel to do it now. But I do apologize for zooming in and zooming out so much. It is hard when you're doing something like this. Let's go ahead and clear these out. I messed up the selection, but work our way around the hood. And that should go all the way to the front. And then we're going to do the same thing underneath here. So we're going to work our way around and select that back edge. Do the same thing over here. So Fusion 360 does a pretty good job of edge selection, but I wish that it did have a little bit more flexibility in terms of the chaining and tangencies. I think that would go a long way in doing some of this work. All right, so now that we have all of those pieces, I'm not worried about the hood itself being able to open. If you do want to make your hood open, then you probably want to make sure that you do split that a little bit further forward. For me, I'm just using it sort of as a dummy surface, so I'm not too worried. Now, the next step is, again, a quick save. And then we're going to create the hood scoop. And we want to create the section where that hood scoop is. So we're going to turn on our canvas. We're going to create a sketch on the top. And now we've got our reference. So this is going to go all the way to this edge here. And because I did my selection priority, I reset that to body. I'm going to go back to edge selection as my priority because that's what I want to use. I'm going to bring this edge in. The hood scoop is going to go down 10 millimeters, so exactly where we offset that gap. And it's simply going to go from the hood shape up here, and it's going to blend down here. So I'm going to use this as my reference, so P on the keyboard. I'm going to use my line tool right in the middle as a reference. I'm going to make sure that that line is construction, so hit X on the keyboard. And then we need to figure out how we're going to break this up. Now, in reality, it's a small triangle here. So what I am going to do is I'm actually going to draw that triangle. So that triangle actually needs to extend past because I'm going to use it to split a face. And I'm going to come to here, and I'm going to come back up to that. Now, you'll notice that those ended up being construction. And again, it's based on the selection priority. I'm going to do select all, which will change my selection priority. I'm going to bring these back, make sure this one's construction. And what we're going to do is we're going to use this extended line to split this surface down here because that's going to give me a reference edge to loft to. And then we're going to patch the rest of it together. All right, so what we're going to do is we need to mirror what we did here. So we're going to select mirror, take these two, go across our center line, and actually, you know what? Let's go back into that sketch. There's one more thing that we need in this sketch to make this work. We are going to need a horizontal line because we have to break the hood up completely. We can't just create that triangle. So let's turn off our canvas and let's use trim. So the trim tool is going to, we have to hold down Control, and we are going to trim away the center section. So we want to get rid of this little piece in here. And you'll notice it's not working. It's trying to trim the whole body. Again, if you find that this happens, you can use split body or split face. So let's try split body. We're going to split this body. The splitting tool, again, is going to be this outside piece, and we're going to allow it to extend. We're going to say OK. And notice that it splits the entire thing. Now, we don't really want to split the entire car up. So if that happens, then we either need to do a better job of sealing this sketch off, or when we're using these tools, let's say split face, then we select an individual face to split. All right, so then our splitting tool, again, hold down Control, and you notice that it's extending out, and that's something that we really don't want, and we can't really get around that unless we create a closed profile. So the other way that we can get around this is by extruding this. So we can select all of these edges, and I am going to bring all of them up. Let's go ahead and rotate this around, and then bring the surface up through the car body. So when we use a surface instead of a sketch, the extend option doesn't necessarily cut through the whole car, and that's the problem that we were having. So now that we have the surfaces, we can use split body or split face. Bodies to split will still be the car, but the splitting tool is going to be these outside pieces. Now, if we're still having trouble here, then we need to try split face. Now, again, this is one of the problems that you'll sort of run into when you have a bunch of surface bodies connected together. You can see that it's still not working. So my last option here, or my last hope, is to either unstitch or go back before we stitch the body together, or to go back into the sketch and take this back edge and delete the projection and then trim it so that we actually have a closed profile sketch. So we'll finish the sketch. And now if we use, let's say, just trim tool, we can use this closed profile as a trim tool, or we can use it as a split body tool, and it should work. So bodies to split, split tool. Again, we're going to hold down Control and finish off that entire profile. Make sure that we select all the pieces. You can see that it did trim away a little too much in the sketch. So that is problematic. That's probably the issue that we're having here. So let's go back and edit the sketch. I know this is getting kind of a pain, but this does tend to happen. So what we want to do is we want to extend this out. Let's do Control Z. I am just going to draw an arc from here to here. And I want that arc to be tangent with that original line. Remember, when we do tangency, we want to make sure that we select the edge that we want to remain first, and then we select this. Sometimes it won't work, and if that's the case, then go ahead and manually adjust this until it's close. I'm going to snap those together. And the main thing is that we want to make sure that this edge is outside of this face. So as long as it's outside of the face, it should be fine, because we already have an edge that's dividing it up. All right, so let's try this one more time. Zoom back out. All right, so we should now have a closed profile with all of this. And if I try trim, I should see that we have an inside section. You can see again, it's not working. All right, so let's make one more tweak. let's just scrap this and let's try again. So what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to project this edge here. I'm going to bring my canvas back. I am going to just cut the outside section. I'm going to come over here and bring that back. I am going to draw a midline from the origin up here, make it construction, and I'm going to apply a symmetry. So for symmetry, we're going to select the two items that we want symmetric and then the mirror line. And that means that these two should now stay symmetric with each other. All right, so now those go well outside the face. What we're going to do is we're going to extrude them up. I'm going to take this. And also note that it will let us grab that profile. Even though that upper edge extends, it will let us grab that entire thing. Let's hide the canvases. And this now gives us something clean that we can use to split it up. So unfortunately, sometimes that does happen when we're using projected references, and you might need to get a little creative. But the good thing is we can now use this to split faces. So I only want to split the hood, and the splitting tool is going to be that extrude. And we don't need to extend it. So this extrude can go away. That can go away. And this face, what I'm going to do, it's part of the body, but I'm going to select it and I'm going to delete it. So we're going to go down to delete and completely get rid of it. So now what we're going to do is we're going to create a loft from this front edge to, I have to rotate this around. Let's go ahead. And we want to go down to this edge. Now, at this point, it's going to create something that is too big, and that's fine. That's okay at this point. But on the front edge, we're going to make sure that we have curvature continuity, and the back edge, we're going to have curvature continuity, and you can kind of see what happens. You can see it's kind of creating a wrinkle here. If we change this to tangent front and rear, and we change these to aligned edges, it should clean it up a little bit. But let's just take a look underneath. So what's happening with the second profile is it's using the wrong face. So we're going to change the tangency direction. And you can see that looks a bit better. The front is overlapping a little bit, but it's okay. Don't really worry about that at this point. We're going to say okay. And then we're going to trim this up. And I know you're probably thinking we just spent all that time creating that sketch to trim, but we need to do it one more time. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this front edge, P to project. I'm going to use L. I'm going to create a mid line. That's going to be construction. And then I'm going to create one more line. So from here, it doesn't even really matter. I just need to extend past, and I need to mirror it to the other side. So that will go across our midline. And this section is going to create the blend between them. So we're going to use that sketch as a trim tool. We can hide the main body because all we really care about is the surface. So the trim tool is going to be this whole thing. So we're going to hold down Control, and then we want to get rid of these little wing pieces on the edge. Now if we bring the main body back, what we should see is we can now connect these pieces together. So we're going to loft from this to this. I'm not going to worry about tangency. I can mirror that, but I can just go ahead and loft it on the other side as well. And then I'm going to stitch them together. So this piece, these two little pieces, and the rest of the car body, those will all go together. You notice that there's a red line here, and that's because we didn't fill in that back section. Not really a problem. If you want to put more detail in there, like a little grille or a grate, you can. But that's going to give us the look that we want for the hood. Now, that took way more time than it should have, but that's partially because I stitched all the pieces together. I could have gone back before this stitch, before the hood was combined with everything else, and it would have been a little bit easier. So at this stage, let's go ahead and save it. And let's bring back some of the body pieces, see what we don't need anymore. So these pieces we don't need. We're going to remove. We need the side skirts, front and rear bumper, all of the window trim, the left and right glass. I'm going to go ahead and bring all those back. So now what we've done is we've got the gap for the door. We have the side skirts, the bumper, we've got the rear bumper, and we've got the hood and the hood scoop. So at this stage, we need to decide what we want to do next. So do we want to create the openings in the grille? Do we want to mess around with the fender flares? Do we want to create the intake for the back? Again, there's really no right answer. You just have to decide what's next for you. For me, I'm going to go ahead and do the openings in the grille. But first, a quick save, and then we can decide what we want the grille to look like. So when we look at this from the front, we obviously created some semi creases where the bumper would be, the middle of the bumper would be. And that's going to be a good sort of division for us to create some openings. Now, most of these cars will have sort of a plate or a recess right here. So we're going to use the same process. We're going to create a sketch. We're going to extrude a surface. And again, we're going to use our line. And this time, I'm just going to create a line for the height that I want. I'm going to select it, Control select the origin, and make them coincident. Now, what that does is it'll let the line be completely in line. It's vertical, and it would extend, and it would hit the origin. This is going to be just a midline, so I'm going to make it construction. And I want to create just a slot, a simple slot. So we're going to go to slot. I'm going to use a center point slot because I have a reference here. I'm going to drag it out where I want it to go to. And then we can create that. And again, this line right here doesn't necessarily have to be there. Like if we're using the slot, we could go back and make the midpoint vertical with the origin. It just kind of depends. I do, however, want to divide this up a little bit more. So I want to keep a section in the middle. So I'm just going to make a vertical line at some point and mirror it. So select that. We have a mirror line, might as well use it. And this section over here will be open, and this section in the middle will be solid. So when we finish the sketch, what I'm going to do is I'm going to extrude that out, the entire outside. I am going to come back to that sketch. I'm going to use it again, but for right now, what I want to do is I want to split body. So I'm going to split the bumper. I'm going to use that extrude we just created, and we're going to say OK. Then we're going to use trim. The trim tool is going to be that portion of the bumper. We're going to get rid of everything in front of it. And then we are going to move it back. But before we do that, we want to use our sketch to split that up. So I'm going to use split face. I'm going to split this face, and the tool that I want to use is that line. I'm going to repeat the process on the other side and use that vertical line. Then we can hide our sketch. This is still just one face. So this front bumper piece is still one face. If we hide the bumper, you can see that we're left with that extrude there, and we should be left with this one right here. You can see that sort of there. So now we have to decide where we want that piece to be. So what I'm going to do is, again, go to Modify, Move Copy. I'm going to move it backwards. 100 millimeters, probably too much, but we're going to say OK. I'm going to bring back the rest of the front bumper. And what we've done is we've just sort of recessed that back. Now, I don't want all of that, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the pieces on the other sides and just hit delete on the keyboard or go to Modify and delete. So now I've got those sort of openings. Now, really before we do that, what should happen is let's roll back before the delete and let's trim. So we're going to use this piece as a trim tool and just get rid of everything behind it. And that way, if we roll to the end, now we've sort of trimmed that opening. What we can do is we can stitch these together. And we might be able to create a fillet on these edges. It's possible that it'll work. Sometimes it will, sometimes it won't. You can see that it won't. So if we want to blend these together, what we need to end up doing is actually cutting them with surfaces and blend them. Not really a big deal. I think I'm just going to leave it like that, honestly, and then stitch this to the rest of the bumper. Now, if you have enough room, you should be able to create a fillet here. Now, I would suggest that you do a small fillet, like 5 millimeters, and that we make sure that we have tangency. You could use curvature continuity, but that will help us blend, blend that together. And we could leave the back section and we could add the fillets and then delete them. There are tons of little things that we could do. But that's a good way to get at least the starting point of an opening. So let's repeat this for the section that's going to be an additional opening as well as the marker lights. So we're going to create a sketch. I'm just going to do this on one side. I'm going to go ahead and use a rectangle in this case. And I want this to be somewhere around here. And I want it to extend out to the bumper. And I'm going to create an arc. And this arc is going to have tangency here. So that means this vertical edge is construction. And I want to sort of keep it in those visual lines that we created. That looks okay. And once again, what I want to do is I want to use this to sort of break things up. But instead of creating that extrude like we did last time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a split face. Now, the reason I'm using split face is because I can pick very specific faces that I want to cut, and then I can select this profile. Now, if I were to use one of the other tools, then what's going to end up happening is it's going to split the wheel arches, it's going to split the rear bumper, it's going to do all kinds of other things. So this will allow us to sort of pick and choose. Now you can see that I need to actually edit that. I want to split it a little bit further so that way I get the full arc. So with this one, the reason I wanted to do it differently is because I want to maintain some of these surfaces. So these two right here, I want to maintain those with just a small inset, but I want to maintain those as sections for a marker light. So what I'm going to do is create an offset, turn off chain selection, but we want to sort of select the faces that we need. And we need to pick in the amount of offset that we want for a marker light. It's going to be pretty small. I'm going to say 5 millimeters. Then I want to select these and hit delete on the keyboard. And then I'm going to select these faces here and I'm going to delete them. So this is going to give me sort of an intake opening, and then I've got the recess for the marker lights. Now it's going to need a little bit more work, but we're on a pretty good start. So I'm going to work my way around the outside here, and then I'm going to work my way around the inside. Rotate this slightly. That third profile was created by accidentally selecting a face, so make sure that we deselect that. And at this point, you might be wondering, if we're doing all of these sort of destructive things to the bumper, how are we going to get this to mirror across the other side? Well, we're going to end up splitting the bumper right in the middle, and we're going to mirror half of the bumper. So that looks pretty good so far. I'm going to stitch those together. I'm going to create a very small fillet in this corner because nothing is really going to have a square corner. So we want to round them off a little bit. So 25, it's probably a bit much. I'm going to go to 15. And if we hide the edges, Control and 4, you can see that we've sort of got this recess. It's just going to be sort of a dummy or a fake for a marker light. And the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create the sort of intake scoop portion of it. So that last sketch that we created, I am actually going to use part of it. So we're going to create a new sketch. I could go back to the original, but I'm going to create a new one. And I want to take that and project it. So P on the keyboard and project some more of that. And what I want to do is I'm going to create an arc in this area. So I'm just going to round that out. So we're going to go to our arc tool. And I'm going to select the top and the bottom, create a tangent arc. And we need to be sort of mindful of this little section right here, because that's going to be problematic. So these being at the midpoint are going to be problematic. So I need to find that midpoint constraint and delete it. I want this arc to go a bit further. And the same thing down here. So if you find that happens, then you might want to manually place the arc at a different location and then add the tangency after the fact. So tangent between the arc and this upper edge, tangent between the arc and the bottom edge. And then if you're happy with that location, one thing that we can do is we can get rid of the projected reference. So again, select those and then trim off the excess. So trim the stuff that we don't need. What we should see is, again, that we've got a closed profile. That's always what we're looking for, is that closed profile. So then we're going to extrude that out. But we don't really want it to be all the way back here. We need to offset it somewhere. So we're going to use the offset option. And then we're going to manually enter a value. So right now we've extruded 200 or 2400 millimeters. So I'm going to say minus 2200. And then the total distance that we're going to go is just going to be minus 200. That should get us through the bumper. So what we should see is that we've got this little extension in here, and it goes all the way through the front of the bumper, and that's fine. And we're going to say OK. So the reason that we did this is so, one, we can trim out this little section right here. So we can use that extrusion as our trim tool. And we can get rid of that little section there. And then we can use sort of the rest of the bumper to trim things out. So if I choose the bumper as my trim tool, I should be able to get rid of the front portion of this. And even though it's not perfect, we can also patch the back of it and then stitch everything together. Now, when I say it's not perfect, it's because some of these edges don't line up right. You can see there's a red line right here, and that red line is telling me that we've got a gap. So you can see that there is a little bit of a gap there. But what we're going to do is we're going to use patch, and we're just going to fill that gap, and we'll stitch it together. So that little piece and the rest of the bumper. So again, what we've done is we sort of made a fake marker light and sort of this intake scoop. It's not completely open, but we can fake it with appearances. And now that we have that, we need to mirror the bumper to the other side. So once we're happy with this shape, if we want to round out any corners, if we want to try to apply a small fillet, I will say that applying fillets can be dangerous sometimes with surfaces like this. So make sure you save before you try. That way you don't end up losing anything. So if I select these edges and I try to go all the way around and just do a very small fillet, 1 millimeter, that'll break the edge. It won't be so hard. And then what I want to do is I want to trim. The trim tool is just going to be my plane. So I'm going to use the YZ plane, and I want to get rid of half of the bumper. Then I just want to mirror the bit of bumper that we have. It's going to go across that plane, and we're going to use join. And it'll have a seam in the middle, but if we hide, because of the tangency and everything that we use, and because we just split it and remirrored it, there's no actual line there. Everything looks good. So now that allowed us to create a front bumper. We've got some openings in it. We've got this opening here, and that really gives us a bit more of a realistic look. So again, let's save that. And let's talk about the next steps. So the next thing that we have to open up is going to be the grille in the back. And then another thing that I did on one of the other models, and I'll go ahead and open it, and we'll take a look at it. So one of the things I did on one of the other models was I actually created the fender flares as these sort of extension pieces. Now, it's hard to see in renders, but this is what the RWB cars actually look like. So these pieces here, those bodies, are fender flares. And I left the original fender flare underneath it, and I just made these sort of extension pieces so that it looked like they were stuck on. Now, you can certainly do that. It may or may not really help the realism, but that's a little bit that you can add to it. It's honestly, I was hoping that it would be more visible in the renders, and it's really not unless you get super close. But Again, those are little details that we can add. And all I really did was I used split lines. I split the fender up. I created an offset. So I used a 0mm offset, and then I just thickened it into a solid body. So at the end, we can take a look at doing that. I don't know that it really added much to it, unfortunately, but we can take a look at doing that at the end. But let's go ahead and do this grill opening here for the motor. Let's go ahead and bring our canvas back, create a sketch. So this was an interesting one because in reality, these have louvers on them. The RWB cars, they actually tend to integrate that cover with the spoiler. They're all sort of one piece. That's not what we're going to do, but we are going to create something. So again, line tool, I'm going to just sort of pick the extents of where I want this to be. I'm going to select the line, control select the origin, make them coincident. I'm going to make that line construction. And then I'm going to use some additional lines because we need those tangency references. So we'll make some lines that are perpendicular. So we've got this one, that'll be construction. We'll just put one down here as well. That'll be construction. And then we can use the arc tool. So find where that is, sort of make a tangent arc. We'll do the same thing down here. Find where that is, make a tangent arc. And for the side, I'm just going to use a straight line. That's what we used for the back window. And just sort of pick where it looks right and create a fillet in the corner. So relatively small fillet, doesn't need to be huge. 25 will probably be okay. And then we need to mirror this. So this actual louver part, you could spend a lot of time trying to make. Not really going to spend a ton of time, but what I do want to talk about is how we can make that happen. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to split that up. So we're going to use that sketch. Again, if you actually want to go in and you wanted to create this as an offset, we'd have to do it in the sketch. So let's edit the sketch. Let's do offset of both sides. I'm going to bring it in 10mm. And now we can use that to split the body. So we can either do an extrude or we can do a split. It kind of just depends on what you want. I'm going to do an extrude. We'll need to select that region. And again, we'll be trimming it out later. So let's go to the right view. And there. All right, before we go too much further, let's do a quick save. And then we'll talk about getting those louvers in there. All right, so now that we have this extrude, let's go ahead and separate these bodies. So this is going to be a little bit different than what we did with like the window, but very similar to what we did with the door and the hood. So we need to create the sort of recess. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to use split body. I'm going to go ahead and split the car body, and I'm going to use the outside surface as the splitting tool. So that should divide up everything. And then I want to use trim because I want to trim the outside portion. So we're going to get rid of that upper outside portion. And we could get rid of the inside too as well, but it's not really required at this time because we're going to be using this to split the hood or the cover for the engine. So again, we want to use things like trim when possible, but we have split body, split face. These can all be used in different instances. So for this one, trim will work fine because our trim tool is this piece, and the section that we want to get rid of is going to be the very small section on the outside. So now what we have here is going to be everything that we need. But one problem with that is now we don't have the little recess between them. So I'm actually going to go back and delete or undo that section. And instead of trimming it, we're going to use split body. So sometimes you'll find that you make a decision and then you have to go back and sort of readjust it. So in this case, we're going to split it. We're going to use trim. Doesn't matter really which piece we pick, but we want to get rid of the upper portion of that extrude. And the main reason that we did this is because that little piece is going to be moved instead of just removed. So we're going to use move copy. we're going to have that go down a distance of, let's say 5 millimeters, just a very small recess. And now what we're left with, if we take the main body and we hide it, we should be able to now use the rest of these little pieces to trim the excess. So what we want is this piece to come down, over, and back up to the rest of the body. So the way that we do this is we can use trim and just select our trim tools and the pieces that we want to remove. Now, I found that trim sometimes behaves a little interesting, and you have to be really careful with where you're selecting and how you're selecting. So sometimes you might find that you need to rotate things a bit. Don't worry about this little segment here. That belongs to something else. You can see that belongs to this body right here. Let's go ahead and hide it for now. I don't really know what that's left over from. But let's try trim again. And once again, we'll use this little inside piece. And again, we're going to get rid of this outside section. One thing you should always note when you're using trim, you see how it says 1 selected in the dialog box. That's going to be the goal. If it happens to jump up to, let's say 6 or 7, then it's trying to use all your selection as trim tools. So now that we have all these pieces, I'm going to stitch them together, but I'm going to omit the rest of the car body for now. Because of the problems we had with the hood, I want to just focus on this section alone. Now, if there's anything else, so we've got the main body here, this little sliver that was left over that happened to be trimmed by something you can see. There's just a little section there that got trimmed. If you want to keep that, then make sure that you stitch these two back together. Or you can just delete them. It's kind of inside and it's not really needed. But if that ever happens, you can just make sure that you find the piece that's the problem. So what we're left with here is the engine cover. I'm going to go ahead and rename that. And then we're left with a couple other body pieces. This is the front bumper. And whenever we trim or mirror or stitch things together, the selection is going to determine what the name is. So the first body, the target body, is going to keep its name. So if I happen to select the wrong one, it's going to get renamed. So let's go ahead and hide some of this other stuff. I'm going to focus on the engine cover. I don't really need any of the trim or the glass. We're just going to focus our attention on this. So as always, quick save, make sure we don't lose anything. We're going to go to the top view, and we're going to start to create some of those openings, those recesses. So I don't really need to see the canvas for this. I do want to rotate it sideways. But what we're going to do is, if we show the canvas quickly, is just, these are a bunch of louvers, and we're going to essentially fake it. We're not going to create a real louvered hood because we're never going to do a render that's close enough to see that. If you are planning on it, then you would want to spend a bit more time making something a bit more realistic. So the main thing that we want to do here is we want to make sure that we follow the curves that we use to create the start and the end. So the way that I'm going to do that is with project. So P on the keyboard, just select one of these edges. And then I want to take that, I'm first going to offset it. I'm just going to pick an amount, say 25 millimeters, and OK. So this is going to get a little tricky because in Fusion 360, we don't have a pattern option that allows us to taper this down. So we're going to have to build this out manually, unfortunately. And the way that we're going to do this is we're going to use a linear pattern, a rectangular pattern. So we're going to pattern this object, and the direction is just going to be along the default Y. I'm just going to pull it out till it looks like it's reasonable, and then I'm going to increase the number of instances. And what I'm looking to do is build out these louvers. And so we're going to have this one connected here. There's going to be a gap, and then the next one connected, and so on. So the tricky part here is if we just do a pattern, then what we end up with is going to be things that are evenly spaced. We're going to have the same distance between each of these as we have to create them. And that, if that's the look you want or the look you're going for, that's perfectly fine. If not, then what we need to do is we simply need to just create a pattern or an offset. And so in this case, 50 millimeters looks okay. And then I can pattern both of those. So rectangular pattern, take both of these and start to pull them out, increase the number, And again, so we're looking to do a jump between this one, jump between this one, jump between this one, and this one here. So that looks pretty good. 300 millimeters spacing with 5 instances. And now the trick comes with the side pieces. So we're going to have to offset these inward and then trim. We could do this a couple different ways. In my case, since I know these were straight lines, we could just draw a straight line, but I am going to project them. So I'm going to P on the keyboard, and then I'm going to use offset. I'm going to project it inward far enough so that I can create those arcs on the end. For me, I'm going to do 75 millimeters. And I'm only going to worry about one side. So right in the middle, I'm going to draw a line. You'll notice that I'm not having any snap points for midlines, so I'm going to go from the origin and just create a whole line here. And then I can use trim to just get rid of everything on this side. Now, you'll notice that it's going to break the constraints. When you create a linear pattern, that linear pattern is actually, so this isn't good. We've crashed Fusion. So this does tend to happen sometimes, which is why we save often. So we are going to send the report so that Fusion 360 knows exactly what's happening, and then we'll jump back in. So here is the recovered document. So we can see that we still have the rear windshield, or the rear glass, I should say. But the last sketch that we were working on is it's not there. So we can go ahead and get started trying to make it again. But sometimes these things happen, which is why every time we make an adjustment or at least a big change, we want to make sure that we do save. So once again, I'm going to use P to project. I'm going to use offset, and we'll bring this in 25 millimeters. And I'm going to offset it again. And you'll notice that it doesn't allow me to offset that one. You have to offset the original. This time I'm going to do 75 millimeters. And then I'm going to pattern those. So we're going to try this again, see if we can get it to work. I'm going to take these two instances, going to pattern it, let's say 5 times. And that should get us what we need. All right, now that we have that, I need to project. And I'm going to go ahead and project both sides this time, and then offset those as well. So I'm going to bring this in 75 millimeters and repeat the process on the other side, bringing that in 75. And because these don't intersect this bottom edge, I need to extend it out, and it's not going to allow me to extend a projected edge. So I'm going to go ahead and just draw a straight line, making sure that it's either parallel, collinear, or tangent. I know that this was a straight line, and even though it's a surface now, from this view, it's still a straight line. So the trick to this is that we are not able to actually trim these. If we try to trim this, it's not going to work because it's going to clear those constraints. Now, if we don't need the constraints, that's fine. Now, if you want to create something that does have those constraints, then you need to do it manually. It's going to take a bit more work. But I'm going to just come in and, using my trim, get rid of all the things I don't need. We'll do the same thing on the other side. So we'll trim this, we'll trim the outside pieces, and you'll find that when we're doing projections, offsets, or patterns, what actually ends up happening is a constraint is being created. Fusion 360 is trying to manage its relationships, and it's trying to figure out what is actually needed. So you can see that that was able to work, and we got it to work. So I'm going to do a quick save in the middle of this sketch. I am then going to take each of these, and I'm going to convert them to construction. So I'm hitting X on the keyboard. You can also do this in the sketch palette. I know we've done this quite a bit. You can select all of them if you want and do them all at once and convert them to construction. So now the last bit we need is to create arcs. So these are going to be tangent arcs, and it's not going to be perfect because the tangency is not going to work with both sides. So if we try to apply a tangency here, you see how everything gets adjusted. So I'm going to do Control Z and undo. The other option that we do have is to extend these out. So these were offset, but if we put them farther out, what we could actually do is create a fillet in these corners. So there are other options that we have depending on how these were sketched. One thing that we could do is we could use a fit point spline. I'm going to do this with 3 points. And the only reason I'm using 3 points is so that I can initially get the tangency to go the direction I want easily. And then I can come back and delete that 3rd point. So that gets me that nice shape. So I'm going to do this for all of them. I'm going to go ahead and just work through adding the splines that I need. Again, using 3 points for each of them, just simply to add that middle point to make it a little bit easier for me. I'll do this side first and then I'll move on to the other side. So again, tangency between the spline and this, essentially this arc, spline to arc. We'll do the spline to arc here and the last one here. Then we'll hit escape to get off our constraint tool and then just delete each of these. So that's the exact process that we're going to repeat over here. Grab our fit point spline, just create a 3-point spline in each of these. One thing I notice is after I create the spline, sometimes it doesn't let me select the next vertex where I want to place one. If that happens, just go ahead and pan a little bit using the middle mouse button, and sometimes that will sort of reset the selection process. I'm not sure why that happens, but sometimes it does. And then once again, we're going to go spline to arc, and just work through. Now, it makes sense to do it this way rather than one at a time because the constraint tools will stay active and it just makes the process a bit easier. Then we hit escape and then just manually go through selecting each one and hitting delete on the keyboard. Now, you will notice that these are different, and that was based on where I placed that point. If you really want them to be all identical, what you can do is you can control the size of each of these. I don't really think it's that critical for what we're doing because, again, this is just going to be a render. But what we're going to do is, in our surface tools, we're going to use split body. So bodies to split, again, is going to be this piece. And I'm going to try to select all of these. It may or may not work. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. We're going to say OK. And in this case, it looks like it does not. It doesn't want to work. So let's try to do it one at a time. So this is the body we're going to split. And we'll try this first one. That one works OK. So we can bring the sketch back, repeat split body, and we'll use this one. The right-click marking menu can be extremely powerful if you get used to it. Just holding down the right mouse button and dragging to that 12 o'clock position is going to repeat the last command. And then holding it down and dragging it to the 3 o'clock position is okay. So again, it sort of speeds it up. And this bottom one is a little tricky for some reason, but you can see that that works. All right, so now that we have that split, the way that we're going to fake this is by selecting each of those. So we're going to just work our way through. And let's see, is this the first one? No, we need the engine cover here. And then we're going to use move copy. And I'm just going to move them down 3 millimeters. And now it just looks like louvers. So if you really want to spend a lot of time making this more realistic, then there are a couple tricks that you need to do. So let's go ahead and save this real quick, and I'll show you how to do one, but I'm not going to do it for all of them. So the way that I would go about sort of creating something like this is I would start with a sketch, and we're going to use sort of the midplane here. I would go to project include and intersect, and I would figure out where it intersects this surface. And then what I would do is I would create the louver shape that I want. So in this case, it would generally be something like a little bit of an arc. And then I would use that to create a sweep. So if we're going to sweep this profile along a single path, you can see what it's doing is it's creating this weird sort of folded over shape. Now, the reason it's doing that is because it's going across the entire profile. If we turn off chain selection and only allow it to go across this edge, then we've got the starting point for the louver. So that allows us to at least get the starting point down, and then what we need to do is we need to blend it into the rest. So one way that you can do this is you can try to loft from here to here. And in some cases, it will work out okay. In other cases, it won't. In this case, it gives us an okay result. It's not perfect, but it really is going to depend on how close you are for your renders. So if you are going to be creating some sort of render that is really close, that might not be realistic enough. But if you want to just get something that looks, looks a little bit more realistic from the side back here, then that could be a good result. Again, I'm not necessarily going to do this for these because I think it's a bit overkill, but that is one way that you can go about creating something that looks kind of similar. So for me, I'm going to go back and just delete those, and I'm going to use these louvers. Another way that you can sort of fake this is by changing the appearance on each of these surfaces, because these could be things like an open mesh or an open aluminum, and that look will give you something pretty unique. So those are all engine covers. This is the main body, so you can kind of see how it looks now sitting back there. It looks pretty realistic. We got the rear glass, the side glass, the bumpers, and we've got most of the details. So a couple more details that we need. We're going to need the headlights or something similar, and you can see at some point in time the shape of the headlight has gotten sort of tweaked and it doesn't look right anymore. So this is one of those cases where unfortunately we have to go back into the form and try to correct it. So we're going to do a save, and we're going to go back all the way before all that detail work that we did and really hope that we don't break anything. So we're going to go to edit. We're going to go into box display, and you can see that this edge has sort of gotten moved out of place. Now, because nothing else is relying on this edge, I'm really hoping that we can fix it without causing any downstream problems. So I'm going to select this edge and this edge. I'm going to go to a front view. I'm going to go into my smooth display, and I'm just going to pull this over and down, and I'm just trying to make it more rounded. So again, box display, smooth display. It looks okay. I think I'm going to make some other minor tweaks. So probably to this edge here. And again, it can be kind of hard to select these. You might need to zoom in. If you're having a lot of trouble when you zoom in and things disappear, then one trick you can do is make sure that you go to orthographic, and then we can zoom in really close without having that same problem. All right, so once again, let's go to smooth display and maybe just make some slight adjustments here. I'm not going to worry too much about it being perfectly circular, but we just want to fix that. So hopefully nothing else is affected by that change. The only thing that could possibly be affected is probably the hood. But since we didn't rely on any of the edges that were created in the conversion of the surface, then it really just has to go through and rebuild everything. And that looks a little bit better. It's a little bit closer. But you can see that we do have an error with a loft somewhere. Sometimes when you get these errors, it really just needs you to go in, and you can see that it's an issue with the hood. And if we have to go through and we have to find the hood, you can see that the hood is actually gone. So we're going to cancel. We're going to roll back to this spot in the history marker and figure out what happened. So there's a trim here, and it looks like the loft itself is going the wrong direction. It looks like this loft is going the wrong direction. So let's make a quick change. For the first profile, it looks like the direction is flipped. Now, one of the problems that happens here is we no longer, so the rest of the hood is actually gone. So what this is telling me is that the trim or this surface delete actually grabbed the wrong surface. Now, these are a bit tricky, so you might need to go back and edit, and then hopefully the rest of it will rebuild properly. And all right, so now you can see that those lofts are working. So even though we didn't really make any changes there, it did still have a problem. You can also see that we're missing a face here in this loft. And if we look, we look, that's probably going to happen a bit earlier. So this one right here looks like it's missing an edge. So what we want to do is we want to extend that edge on both of these profiles and try to just extend it out. If it doesn't work, then we can always manually build it. So we'll go in, loft from here to here, and just stitch that to the rest of it. So you can see, even though we didn't really affect anything, or we didn't really adjust anything that we worked on, there were downstream problems that happened. And unfortunately, it does happen, which is why I say that we need to be really sure that we're happy with the body shape before we do anything. And you can see there are other problems that we're having here. So these are all things that you're going to run into if you go back and you decide to change something. So let's just work through them. So this extrude is fine. The split body has an issue, probably lost its selection. So bodies to split is missing, so we need to select that. And then the trim should work okay. The split should work okay. That trim should work okay. The move and the other thing and so on. Now, part of the reason that some of this happens is because the names that each of these bodies take on is relative to the selection process. When you're trimming, when you're splitting, when you're doing any of those different tactics, those selections are going to affect things. So if you happen to make just a slight change and the faces or the edges do make an adjustment, then sometimes that's enough to sort of flip it out. But it wasn't too bad. We were able to correct those problems. And let's go ahead and let's just bring back all the bodies, see what we have, make sure that everything's okay, and then we'll save our work. All right, so everything looks good so far. You can see that we've got our door seam, got our hood seam, we've got our hood scoop there, we've got the trim on the windows, we've got the seam for the side skirt and the rear bumper, we've got the rear hatch, we've got the opening for the tail lights, and everything looks like it did build properly. So again, let's go ahead and save this. I want to bring back the edges and then we can move on and figure out the next step. So another quick note, as we go through this process, as we run into these problems, these are the types of problems. They're not planned. I'm not intentionally working myself into a corner, but these are the types of things that happen when we're designing parts like this. Whenever we have complex shapes or curves and then we begin to add all these additional features to them, you can see that there are quite a lot. Once you start adding trims and stitches and extrudes and move bodies and all these different things, we've got dozens, if not 100 features there. So there are going to be problems and we need to be able to work backwards. For simplicity's sake, I am not going to go through and create the offset fender like I showed you in the other version of this. And simply because it just isn't visible in the renders. So it doesn't really add any value. If it was really visible, if you want to put hardware in there and make it a different color, let's say carbon fiber, then by all means you can do that. And maybe at the very end I can show that, but I don't think it's worth our time. What I do want to talk about, however, is I want to create a headlight. We need to create side view mirrors, and we also need to address the wing and the taillights and the Aero. So these are all other pieces that we need to talk about. So since we are up front, or we have been working in the back and we're working in the front, we just fixed a few things. Let's go ahead and let's just take care of the headlights now. So for the headlights, I'm going to create a new sketch. Doesn't matter, just pick any old plane. But for this one, what I want to do is I want to create a 3D sketch. So I need to select 3D sketch in the sketch palette. Then I need to go to Create, Project Include, and Include 3D Geometry. For Include 3D Geometry, what I want to do is I want to bring the 2 points at the top and the bottom of the headlight. Now, the reason that those are important is because this is going to help us define a lens that we're going to put on the front of this. I'm not going to go through the process of creating chrome headlight trim and all the different little trim pieces on the car because when I modify things in reality, I tend to get rid of all that stuff anyways. If you're making a custom car, at least something like this, you're not going to be putting things like chrome trim back on it. Maybe you are, maybe you aren't, I don't know. But for me personally, I'm not. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an arc. And this gets a little tricky in a 3D sketch. So we need to be sort of mindful of the plane that is active right now. You can see that we're looking at the right plane, which is the YZ plane. And I am going to try to snap to these points. So I'm going to create an arc and try to snap to those points. And you can see that it's not working. Now, this is one of the problems with 3D sketches is they can be a bit tricky. So let's try it again with a little bit of a rotation on the view and try to snap to that point, snap to this point, and make sure that the plane that's active here, again, is that YZ plane. And what we want to do is we want to create a little bit of an arc. I'm going to go to a right-hand view, and I want to create an arc in this view. This is going to be the lens of our headlight. So now that we have that, I'm going to turn off 3D Sketch. It'll still show that different coordinate system here, but we want to make sure that that lens has that little bit of arc to it, and then we're going to finish the sketch. We're going to use a patch. I'm going to left click to deselect everything. I'm going to use patch, select this opening, and then I want to use an interior rail, and I'm going to use this as a rail. You'll notice it's not perfect, but it is fairly close. And this is one of the downsides that we have when we're talking about using these form bodies, and these edges are not perfectly circular. So if we need it to be a bit more circular, what we can do is we can create a trim and trim that edge first to try to make that a little bit more round. Or we can use something like a cylinder and try to clean it up. For our purposes, it's going to be close enough. Now, what I want to do at this point is I want to hide the body and I want to work with just this. So now that I have this lens, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a ruled surface. We're going to change the type to direction, and we're going to select this edge as the start. And the direction we want to go is back to the XZ plane. The reason we want to do this is we're going to build a sort of a headlight bucket. We want to add some taper to that. So with the taper, let's try to do, let's say 20 degrees. You can see that it's tapering outward. So we're going to say minus 20 degrees and allow it to taper inward. So this is going to start to fill in a section of the headlight. Once we have that, I'm going to patch the back of it. And now we have this sort of closed headlight area. Now, again, the curvature on the front of it is not great. We could work with that more if we wanted to, but again, this is just going to be the general process. I want to stitch the back and the side, that tapered side together, but I'm going to leave the front disconnected for now. This front piece is going to be the glass. I'm just going to call it glass. I'm going to hide that for now because the next thing that I want to do is I want to build something that is going to actually emit light. So the process that we go through here really depends on what you're designing. We could sketch something out. So for example, if we sketch on the front plane, what I could do is I could draw a circle. Let's just pick roughly the center of the headlight. So remember that the headlight itself is this outside edge, right? I'm going to give these a dimension between them so that they don't overlap. I'm just going to say 8 millimeters. And then I'm going to start to move them around. Holding down Control or Command will help you override those persistent constraints. And what this is going to allow me to do is build sort of like a halo ring that will emit light. Then what we can do is we can create another cylinder on the inside, and that will emit light as well. So with this, we can use solids and we can extrude, let's say extrude that. And I'm going to start from an object. And that object is going to be this. And then I can sort of pull it forward. So you can see that we're sort of building that headlight. And then we want to use that same sketch again. So go back into the sketch, turn it on. And we're going to do the same thing with that little halo ring. So we're going to extrude. This one's going to be a little bit trickier, because we don't have, we don't have something as clean as we had before. So If I try to start from this entire body, it's not going to really work out very good. So I'm going to try to start from here and pull it forward, and you can see that it doesn't work. So for this one, we might actually end up needing to use the solid body to trim it, just because that offset isn't working. Another thing that we could try is we could use this face to try to extrude from and then extrude it back. And again, sometimes it's just not going to work. So let's try offset. Let's look at our coordinate system. Let's go 2000, see where that puts us. And it looks like it might be going the wrong direction. Yeah, so negative 2000. It's all based on the XYZ coordinate system. So negative 2000 puts us there. And then we can sort of come back and we can have those surfaces to sort of trim things. So depending on where you want it to go, how far you want it to go, we can either use the lens, that glass lens, to trim it, or we can just sort of set it back a little bit. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use the glass lens to trim it. So I'm just going to add, let's say, another 10 millimeters, maybe 15, just so it goes all the way through. And it looks pretty good. So now what we can do is we can split body, and the body to split will be the solid, and the splitting tool is going to be the surface body. And then we'll repeat that process. So the body to split is this, and the splitting tool is now going to be that front lens. And then we can just look for the bodies that we don't want. So this is the one we want to keep, this one we want to get rid of, and that one we want to get rid of. So right click and remove. If we hide the glass, we now have this sort of halo effect, or this piece here, and we've got this piece here. When we get to doing appearances, we'll talk more about actually applying those light appearances. But for right now, what we want to do is we're just going to go ahead and take the glass. We're going to take the right-hand headlight, RHHL, and we're going to call this one HL, headlight, and we'll call this one halo. We're going to take all 4 of these and we're going to mirror them. So we'll go ahead and mirror them, cross our midplane just like everything else. And this is a good starting point for the headlights. So it'll look a little bit different once we get started actually applying appearances. We might decide that we need to move things back a little bit. But again, it's going to be just sort of faking it. That's what we're going to do. So the next step in the process is to either add mirrors, or to finish the spoiler, or to deal with the Aero. So as always, let's do a quick save. And let's talk a little bit about the Aero. So with the Aero pieces, we really just sort of made this kind of custom shape. I really didn't have a good idea of what I wanted the Aero to be. But what we can do at this point is we can use our surface tools and let's say trim. So if the trim tool is our bumper, then we can get rid of everything that is outside of that bumper. Now, if we rotate this around, you can see that it cut away most of that other stuff and it only left these little pieces here. So if we do Control Z and undo, let us use split body instead. So with split body, the body to split is going to be our bumper. Our splitting tool is going to be this Aero piece, and we're going to say OK. Now, if we go in and we actually hide the Aero piece for right now, you can see that it split the bumper into a bunch of other pieces. So the bumper that we want to keep is this piece, and then all these little pieces we want to get rid of. So that's going to be these 3. We're going to right click and remove, and then the original rear bumper. And again, things get renamed, and now we've got these little pieces here. We want to bring back our Aero, and then now we can use either split body or trim. And in this case, if I do trim, select this, and if we try to trim this, you can see it's not working because of how they intersect here. So let's try to do split body. So split body, bodies to split will be this. Our splitting tool will be this. Allow it to extend. And you can see that it didn't work. So if this doesn't work, what we can end up doing is manually sort of building out these Aero features. We can leave the entire Aero piece in here, or we can trim this up to a position that makes sense. So I want to take the Aero and the rear bumper, I'm going to right click and isolate those two, so I'm only working on that. So we can see here where the arrow is going, and we have to figure out how we want to connect the two. So what I really want to do is I want to trim this out to sort of match the bumper. Now this could be done back in the forms. We could make adjustments to the shape. We can, sort of figure out what's going to work. Or we could just build out the arrow directly here as surfaces. Now, depends on what your goal is. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to those last 4 removes. I'm going to get rid of them. I'm going to get rid of the split body. And I want to focus on building out that arrow a little bit different. So I'm going to start a sketch. And I am going to use symmetry. So I'm going to start with a vertical line just right in the middle, turn it into construction. Then I'm going to sort of build this out on the other side. So using some lines, I am going to create just something very similar. I'm going to come up, over, and down, and just over to the middle. Before I do any mirrors, I'm going to go ahead and add some fillets there. I'll go ahead and add one here as well. And this piece right here, I'm probably going to add another line to. So line is going to come over, and I'm just going to take it back up into the bumper and then add some fillets to here as well. So select these two, add some fillets, and that looks okay. So now that we have this piece, I'll just mirror all of this to the other side. If these constraints are ever in your way, you can always turn off the show constraints, and that'll just clean things up a little bit. You want to make sure that it's on whenever you are actually trying to fully dimension and constrain something. But with what we're doing here, sometimes it's just kind of in the way. All right, so now we have this shape. I'm going to offset it. I'm going to take the entire thing and just maybe offset it. Let's go ahead and let's just say 10 millimeters. We'll put it up 10. And then I'm going to use my line tool to connect it to make it a complete closed profile. At this point, I can hide the original arrow. I don't need to see it, and decide if I want to do any more. So I think that's okay. The next thing I want to do is extrude that out. So let's go ahead and just take this entire profile. I am going to offset it. Let's go ahead and go 1500 millimeters, see where that puts us. And maybe bring it back a little bit. Let's do 1000 and 1250. And then we'll pull this all the way out through the bumper. All right, so we're going to use that to trim the bumper, and this is going to be, it's going to be trimmed from the side as well. So let's go to a right-hand view, and let's just create a sketch. We'll use that right-hand plane. And what I'm going to do is go to Create, Project, Include, and Intersect, and I'm going to figure out the curve of the bumper. And I'm going to take the curve of the bumper, and I'm going to offset it a little bit. Then I'm going to use a line and just sort of come down and trim it. So I want the line to be tangent, so I'm going to select both of those, and notice that we don't get a tangent option. So I'm going to take the offset constraint and delete it, and that'll let me trim this line, and then I can apply my tangency. So again, all I'm looking to do is, I was looking to roughly match the shape of the bumper, and then I'm going to go ahead and add another line here, just take this a bit further underneath the car. Before we get out of this, I'm just going to add a fillet so it's nice and smooth, and then finish. So we can use this sketch to trim, so that'll be our trim tool, and we'll just get rid of everything that's on this side of it. All right, so now we have some Aero features that stick out, and we want to get rid of the space that's left in the bumper. So we're going to end up patching the opening, the end of this. We're just going to let it create a patch there. And that'll sort of fill in the outside area. It's not perfect, but another way that we can do this is we can take that original sketch, and instead of trimming, So if we get rid of that trim, we bring back this sketch, we can just use this as an extrude. And then I'm going to go ahead and use symmetric. And then what we can do is instead of just trimming it with the sketch, we can trim it with the surface. So this is our trim tool. This is what we want to remove. Let's go ahead and rotate this so we can see it better. Trim tool, remove that. Repeat the process. This time, this is our trim tool, and we want to remove everything outside of it. And then we can just stitch those two together. So that'll be a little bit cleaner than the other version. Now we can use trim or split body. It kind of just depends on, again, your geometry. If we try to maybe trim out these inside sections. So get rid of that and get rid of that. And now you can see we sort of built in some Aero. Now, currently these are two different surface bodies. Not really going to matter all that much. We could trim it out a bit more so that they attach, but honestly, again, from a render perspective, it's probably not going to matter too much. Just kind of depends. So what I want to do is I'm going to go back to the top level and unisolate all to bring everything back. It'll bring back all those surface bodies. And you can see that looks, it looks pretty good. It's got some interesting detail to it. We could make adjustments if we want to. We can sort of get rid of these wings if we want to, but for right now, I think that's that's sort of okay. That's what I'm going to leave it as. Might decide to change that later. As always, quick save. Make sure we don't lose anything. And now we can sort of approach the wing. So the wing is very unique, and in this case, we don't have a flat section. We don't have a flat that we can use to create a sketch. So what we're going to do is we're going to create an offset plane, and we want to put that plane at a position that makes sense. So I am going to use the plane in roughly the location where the end of our sort of engine cover is. And we can vertically see about where that is. And I'm going to say, okay. And then what we're going to do is we're going to sketch on it. So when we create a sketch, we're going to use project, include, and intersect. This time I'm going to say intersects with bodies. I'm going to select that body. And this is going to put a curve exactly where it intersects with the wing. And from here, I can begin to build out the wing support. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just sort of bring the wing support down far enough that it definitely goes into the body and sort of bring it back and up to the wing. And then we can build out whatever shape we want inside of here. So if we want some parallels and we want to build out some, maybe some triangles, we can do that. Just find out where things are parallel and then build in some, shapes and some supports. So that little line there can go, bring that one in here. And, it doesn't look great, but, that will give us what we need just for our renders. We're going to go to solids. We're going to extrude this out. And I also want to include this profile. And if we're having trouble selecting it, we can always hide the wing and select that profile as well. And if we bring this out, let's say 10 millimeters, let's go to the back. Let's bring that out 15 millimeters as a new body. We can see where the end of the wing is. So if we bring it out further, we can see where it is. We can see where it falls on the body. It looks like about 20 millimeters is going to be okay. I'm going to say okay. I'm going to add some fillets just to round things off. Just grab all of these square corners and go ahead and just round them off. And then we're going to use the inside, let's go ahead and rotate this around. We're going to use the inside face of this to split the wing body. So we're going to go to split body, and the bodies to split will be the wing, and the splitting tool will just be this inside face. Now the face is planar, so it's automatically going to extend out. And I'm going to repeat that process, and the body will be the wing, and the split tool is going to be the mid plane. So I want to split that wing right in half. So we're going to go ahead and select the YZ plane. And then the wing piece that I want to keep is going to be this little section here. So I'm going to go and I'm going to find the wing that I don't want, get rid of that. And then if we want to build out any additional end caps or if we want to do anything else, we certainly can. But what I'm going to do is just mirror that. So we're going to create a mirror, select bodies. I'm going to take this piece and the piece of the wing, mirror them across that, join them together, and now we've sort of built out a little wing. You can see that there's an error with the mirror, and that's because there are multiple solid bodies. If we just set it to new body, it should be fine. And then we can use combine to join the two pieces of the wing together. And there you go. Now, typically what you would have is extra little plates or something on the side. Again, this is an area where you can really spend a lot of time sort of customizing things. So you have to kind of decide what's going to work best for you. Now, after I look at this, I can tell that that extra little piece on the outside, I wanted to keep. So I think that looks a bit better. And then we can sort of put something on the end. So I'm just going to modify the feature for the mirror, and I'm going to select the other wing body as well. So for the objects to mirror here, I'm going to select that as well. And then in the combine, I'm going to edit this feature, and I'm just going to add those extra little pieces as well. And it looks like we might still have a couple pieces there. So let's go back, let's edit the feature. The main body is that, and we want to make sure that's included as well. So that should give me one big wing and the supports for it. Now, again, if you want to add more detail, what we can do is create a sketch. And I am going to just make something extremely simple. So I'm going to go like this, back and back over. I'm going to add some fillets to the corners, do some small ones at the front, make them a little bit bigger. And then I am going to just extrude that. So I'm going to take all the profiles and I want to extend it out. So we're going to offset it. And let's just go ahead and give it 20 millimeters. And then we'll extrude that maybe 5 millimeters. We'll select join. And that sort of builds out our little end cap. So then we just have to mirror it to the other side. This time, instead of mirroring a body, we're going to mirror a feature. We're still going to mirror it across the same plane and just allow it to build it. So you can spend as little or as much time as you want on that. I'm not going to worry about the interface between the car. You could use the car body to split this so that it matches exactly. You could do a split face here and create a thicken so that you have a bracket. In general, what would happen is the body would get cut and this would go down to a chassis member, probably inside the engine compartment or right here where you could just cut out a small piece of the body. So I think in reality, that's probably an okay solution. These are probably a little thicker than they need to be, but you know, again, you can spend as little or as much time on these details as you want. I do want to make sure I go back to perspective with ortho and make sure that everything is looking okay. Do a quick save. And let's go ahead and let's build out a simple mirror. So again, with the mirrors, you could spend a lot of time, but what I'm going to do is go to create form. And I'm going to start with just a box. I'm going to do this on the front plane. I don't need symmetry, so I'm just going to draw a box up here about where it needs to be. I'm going to move it into place and go to the side and move it into place. One thing that you want to be careful with is don't get hung up by rotating it just yet. Because the mirror is not going to be flat like this, it's going to be rotated, but then the coordinate system starts to get a little tricky when we modify it. So keep it straight for as long as possible. I'm going to sort of stretch this out, make it a little bit more Aero. go to the front view, and the attachment to the car can be done in here, or you can do it after. It kind of depends on the shape you want to go for. So what we could do is we could select all of these side faces. I can rotate this down and select the bottom ones as well. And then we can extrude them out. So again, holding down Alt, sort of bring them down and into the car. Take a look at it in smooth display. And obviously that doesn't look great. So the way that we go about fixing this is we start to control it with inserting edges. So if I double click down here and I insert an edge and pull it up close, when we look at this in smooth display, you can see that we've got some edges, but they don't go all the way. So you can see the edges aren't on the other side. So we're going to go to Modify and Insert Edge. And once again, we're going to pull it up relatively close. And then we want to use Insert Point. Double click the mouse wheel to bring it back in view. And what I want to do is I want to take it from this edge to wherever that edge ended up. And we want to do the same thing on the bottom. Go to Insert Point, find out where we put those edges. And now if we take a look at this in smooth display, it should start to look a little bit more controlled and refined. Let's go back to a front view. Go back to box display, and if we grab all these edges, we can begin to scale them down. And then we can insert some more edges. This should be a complete loop now. So if we go to Insert Edge, we should be able to add an entire loop here. And then we can use Edit Form to scale that down and tighten it up. So again, these are all the little things that we just need to spend some time on to figure out what shape you want and what you want it to look like. If we want to add some more control, what we can do is we can tighten up this front face just by adding a control loop there, and that gets us pretty close. The last thing you might want to do is rotate it into place. You could do this after the fact, but we could also just rotate it and position it here. And this is going to be a solid body. So when we come back out, you can see that now we've got a solid body mirror. We can use the actual body to trim it. So if we use split body, bodies to split, the splitting tool is that door. And now what we've done is we've got this body and then we've got the little piece on the inside. So we can use remove. And to add some more detail, we could extrude on that face and remove some material. I'm not going to actually do that, but if you want, you can create a sketch and you can just create an offset in here and actually build out some glass. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to mirror that to the other side. So mirror bodies, and we'll push that to the other side. And I'm going to call this left hand mirror, and we'll just call this one right hand mirror. All right, so the next thing, let's go ahead and let's bring all of our wheels back and just see what this thing looks like. So save it before we lose anything. And so far everything looks pretty good. I think that we still need to trim the tail light. So I'm going to go to Trim, and I want to get rid of the outside of the tail light. And we're going to repeat that using the bottom bumper as the trim tool. And if there's a bottom piece of that tail light inside the car, is kind of tricky. It looks okay. So everything looks okay. We've got this taillight piece, and all we're going to do is we're just going to apply a red color to it. I'm not going to worry too much about the inner details of the taillight, but everything looks pretty good. We got some Aero features. We've got the body seams and the divisions. We've got the glass. We've got the headlights. We've got the bumper. We didn't fill the bottom in or the back of the wheel arches or anything like that. So if those are things that you want to fill in on the body for rendering reasons, a couple different ways that we can do it is we can, again, we can just sort of fake it. So we can loft from one edge to another. So maybe here to here. And then we can just extend this up. As long as it doesn't cut through anywhere, the rest of the body, it can just sort of be a placeholder to sort of block out the back. You can also trim it, and you can spend the time to sort of stitch things together, but the bumper, the side skirt, and the body are all different. So just having like a blank panel in there can sort of work for you. So we can go ahead and put one on the other side, and you can do the same thing in the back. So we'll just do a quick loft. We'll go from back to front, and we'll just extend this edge up. And again, as long as it doesn't cut through the body anywhere, don't really have to worry too much about trimming it or worrying too much about it, but just sort of blocking it off. And then the other thing that you might want to do is just block off the bottom of the car. So we loft from side skirt to side skirt, for example. Maybe create a blank panel for the back of the grille or the opening, and we can sort of fill in some of this stuff. So if we go loft from, let's say, here to here, if we stitch that and the rest of the bumper together, then you can just use patch to fill in this opening. And again, we can just sort of loft from here to here. And some small gaps are not really going to be a big deal, but just getting the major gaps, the big gaps filled in will really help, because then you're not going to see daylight through any of the body panels. So it looks pretty good so far. If we hide the edges, everything looks pretty good. And again, the sort of the devil's in the details, right? If you spend a lot of time building out a spoiler or building out your Aero package or building out some custom wheels, that's really going to set it apart. I don't have brake rotors behind the wheels. We could, again, fake it by just putting some surfaces back there. But again, it really just depends on how much time you want to spend. I do want to do a quick save. The last thing that I want to do before we end this video is to just go into the render workspace, because the shading is a bit different there. Right now, everything has a metallic appearance, but we could go in and we could start adjusting the appearance of everything. I'm not going to worry about that in this video. We will talk more about rendering in a future video, but really quick, I'm just going to hit A on the keyboard to open up my appearances, and I'm going to go into glossy paint and just apply a white paint to the body, a white paint to the bumper, a white paint to the side skirts, and let's go ahead and do a white paint on the rear bumper as well. And that at least gives us a good idea as to what the car looks like. And then I'll do one on the trunk. And again, if you want to fake things, because these are individual bodies, we can make each of these black. Right now they're glossy, but they could be any color, and that kind of helps us with the sort of the deception. If you are going to spend some time applying appearances, just remember that you can use the faces option. So for example, if we go to glass and we find a glass that we want to use, so let's say that we have a tinted glass. Let's do gray. I can drag and drop it onto an individual face. So that's what you're going to have to do for like the windscreen and for the rear glass. Just go ahead and drag and drop it onto anywhere that the glass should be. And then for the sides, it's going to be a little bit different, because it's sort of its own body, but you can still do the individual faces if you want. Let's go ahead and rotate this around. For some reason, the pivot point was way in the middle. So Again, you can sort of, do the same thing and just drag and drop it on those faces. These pieces are going to end up having to be black, and if you want to do that you can box select a bunch of things in the browser, then we can just drag and drop it and it'll apply it to all of them at once, kind of speed up the process a little bit. So again, this is not going to be a rendering video. We're going to talk about that in a future video. We'll deal with the headlights and all of that stuff as well. But at this point, I'd say that looks pretty good. I'd say that we're about 98% of the way there. So we still have a little bit more work to do. I think for the most part, the design is done. It's just going to be setting appearances and maybe making a couple other little tweaks. But for the most part, I think that we're pretty much there. You can do an in-canvas render to get a quick idea as to what your car looks like. Again, we haven't done anything with the headlights or anything like that, but we will be talking more about that in the next video. But at this stage, I think we are done with the third video, which is, again, the bulk of the work is pretty much done at this stage. Let's go to a perspective view and just take a look at what we've done. So I'd say everything looks pretty good. We boxed off the bottom, and we pretty much got all the details. We don't have any door handles, but I don't really think I'm going to spend time on that. I think most of the details are there. But at this stage, if you have any questions, please let me know. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.